It was my best friend Luke's idea to form our own detective agency, inspired by the shows we loved watching together. We lived on Brook Street in a small town in Oregon, so we called ourselves the Brook Street Sleuths. We advertised our services on the community board in Elmer's Market, which usually cost 25 cents a week, but Mr. Elmer kindly allowed it for free. We worked on various cases in the space of a month or so over one summer. Who's been taking the blackberries from Miss Jacob's brambles? Solved. Almost everyone who passed by, and lots of chipmunks. What made the small hole in Lowry's front yard? Solved. A chipmunk. Yeah, we had an abundance of chipmunks in town. But not all the mysteries involved the little critters. They were clearly not mysteries to the adults who hired us, but the best thing about living in that kind of community was the willingness of our neighbours to contribute to our idea of fun. Luke and I were rewarded with many sodas and candy bars for our sleuthing skills. Despite our success rate, the Brook Street Sleuths was a short-lived agency. Our last ever case began with a very real mystery. Where is Mr. Page's dog? Frank Page was a retired widower and happened to be my next-door neighbour. His dog, Milo, a Yorkie, was what Frank referred to as a pain in the proverbial. Milo was an expert escape artist. He was always getting out of the yard and causing mischief in town, but would usually come back home with his tail wagging after an hour or two. One evening, we could hear Frank calling for Milo from the doorstep. He'd escaped as per, but it had been several hours and he still hadn't returned. My dad offered to drive around the neighbourhood to look for him, but had no luck. The next morning, I helped Frank make a missing poster. We stuck a photograph of Milo on a sheet of paper using a glue stick, and I neatly wrote the details underneath in black marker as dictated by Frank. Then we went to Elmer's Market to use the photocopier and made 10 copies. It should have cost us $1, but Mr. Elmer said there was no charge and wished us luck in finding him. Frank bought me a cola as a thank you. "You're a good kid, Ricky," he said, patting my back. I could hear he was upset. "We'll find him, Mr. Page," I said. "The Brook Street Sleuths are on the case." He chuckled. "He's a piece of work, but I'd be lost without him. I'll go knock for Luke just as soon as we've put up these posters." We left one on the board in Elmer's, then stuck the remaining posters on telegraph poles and the 2 bus shelters in town. I asked Frank if I could keep hold of the original photograph of Milo. That way, I could show it to the local residents during our investigation. Before I knocked for Luke, I went back home to tell my parents. "Don't wander too far, Ricky," said Mom, "and stay out of the woods. I don't like the thought of you boys in there alone." There was a woodland area that lined the back of town. I absolutely planned on looking in there. I told my mom I wouldn't though, of course. I grabbed my bike and rode to Luke's to fill him in on the details. There, we rode around town and knocked on doors, asking if they'd seen Milo. It was mostly unsuccessful, but one lady had some potentially useful information. "Now that I think about it," she said on the doorstep, "I did see a little dog sniffing around the brambles on Maple Road yesterday." "Thank you, ma'am," said Luke. We discussed it as we retrieved our bikes from the end of the driveway. "There are 2 houses on Maple Road with brambles in the yard," he said. "Miss Jacobs," I said, "and the Deans. Why did it have to be the Deans?" The Dean family were not known for their warm community spirit, especially the oldest son, Tommy. He was a senior and notorious troublemaker who had caused Luke and I a lot of grief. The family also had a much bigger, meaner dog that I would probably treat Milo as a snack. "We'll go to Miss Jacobs' house first," said Luke. "If we're lucky, we won't have to go to the Dean's at all." We left our bikes on the sidewalk and knocked on Miss Jacobs' door. "Well," she said warmly, "if it isn't the Brook Street sleuths." "Hello, Miss Jacobs," we said in unison. "What can I do for you boys?" "We're looking for my neighbor, Mr. Page's dog," I said, showing her the photo. "He went missing yesterday afternoon." "Oh no," she said. "I'm familiar. I sometimes see him in the yard by the brambles, but I haven't seen him for days." "Thank you anyway, Miss Jacobs," said Luke. "Of course," she said. "I'll keep my eye out. Oh, and help yourselves to blackberries." As we walked down Miss Jacobs' pathway, we looked at each other with concern, knowing we now had to visit the Deans. We took the opportunity to eat a few of the ripened berries before braving it, then wheeling our bikes to their house. The yard wasn't as kempt as the others in the neighborhood. It was overgrown, and there were scraps of metal from various vehicles dotted around like a junkyard. We slowly walked up the path. As soon as we knocked on the door, there came loud barking from inside that made us jump, followed by shouting. The door flew open, and Mr. Dean was standing there, holding back their monster of a dog by the collar, just barking at us like crazy. "Shut the hell up," he yelled down at it. It quietened down, but growled under its breath. "What do you want?" "Hello, sir," I stuttered. "We're asking around to see if anyone has seen my neighbor's dog." I took out the photo. "He went missing yesterday." "What makes you think I had anything to do with it?" he snapped. "It's not like that, sir," said Luke. "We're just asking if you've seen him, that's all. He sometimes wanders around the neighborhood." "Who do you think you are?" he said. "Columbo or something?" Luke and I turned to each other, like it had been a bad idea. "We're sorry to have bothered you, sir," I said, turning to leave. "Believe me," he said, "if that rat had been anywhere near here, Kane would have sorted it out." The dog started barking again, and we hurried back down the path. "I don't want to see you boys on my property again," he yelled after us. "I won't hold him back next time." He laughed loudly as we quickly rode away, my heart beating hard. We stopped around the corner to catch our breath. Then we started to laugh uncomfortably. "God, I hate that family," said Luke. We heard the roar of an engine, and a rust bucket of a car came hurtling around the corner, its tires screeching on the road. It was Tommy Dean behind the wheel. When he noticed Luke and I, he gave us the finger and sped away out of sight. "So suspicious," I said, "but maybe too obvious." Luke shrugged. "They're assholes, but I think we need to investigate more first." When it felt like we'd exhausted all avenues in town, I suggested we look in the woods. Luke was apprehensive, as, like me, he was forbidden from the woods without an adult. But it seemed logical that a dog would be drawn to the woods, especially with all the chipmunks to chase. "If we do find Milo there," I said, "we'll just pretend we found him someplace that won't get us in trouble." We looked around for an hour or so, shouting Milo's name from time to time. It got to the point where we figured if Milo was somewhere he could hear us, he would have made himself known by now. Before we left, we both confessed to needing the bathroom badly, so we went in opposite directions to find a secluded spot to pee. "Ricky!" I heard Luke scream after a few minutes. I quickly finished and retrieved my bike. "Where are you?" I yelled, my nerves on edge. "Over here!" I saw him standing in a small clearing and rushed over. "What is it?" I asked, out of breath. He didn't answer. Luke had found what looked like the site of a sacrificial ritual. There were strange symbols drawn onto several tree trunks in what appeared to be blood. In the center was a slab of stone with a chalk drawing of 3 triangles, all pointing the same way but overlapping each other. In the center of that was a severed animal paw. It had the same auburn-colored fur as Milo's. "Oh my God," I said quietly. "I really want to leave now," said Luke in an almost whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, come on." As I went to pick up my bike, I saw a small satchel sitting by a log. I walked over to it, Luke spotting it too. "Leave it, Ricky," he said. "It's evidence," I said, about to pick it up, but then I remembered not to contaminate it. I used the stick to lift the flap open and peek inside. There was a pack of cigarettes and some school textbooks, senior biology and math. "Student," I said. I found a large leaf and used it to cover my fingertips, opening the first page of the biology book. Written in pencil in the top right corner, Tommy Dean. A shiver went through me as I told Luke. We got on our bikes and rode like the wind, heading straight to the sheriff's office. We burst in and both started yelling. "Whoa, fellas," said Deputy Campbell from behind his desk. "Calm yourselves. Now, what seems to be the problem?" We explained everything. Luke and I were escorted back to the woods to show the deputy what we had found. "Sweet mother of Jesus," he said, calling it in. There was a search conducted at the Dean's house. Inside Tommy's bedroom, they not only found an ancient book of the occult containing the very symbols found at the scene, but also Milo's collar. Apparently, he protested his innocence as they took him in for questioning. I heard all of this through the walls as my parents talked about it that night, having been banished to my room. Poor Mr. Page was devastated. The disturbing nature of it rocked our sleepy community, but Luke and I were commended for our help in the investigation. We both received honorary badges from the sheriff's department, making us feel like real investigators. After a couple of days, Miss Jacobs required our services again. My mom was reluctant for me to carry on playing detective, as she called it, but my dad talked her around. Luke and I went to visit Miss Jacobs late afternoon and were greeted by a wonderful smell. "Take a seat, boys," she said. "I baked you a blackberry pie. Call it a thank you for your services to the community." "Thanks, Miss Jacobs," we both said together, excitedly sitting in the dining table where a warm pie sat in the center. She cut 2 slices and plated them up, handing us one each. "Bon appetit," she smiled, taking a seat as we started tucking into the delicious pie. "Well done on your investigation. That must have been quite a shock, discovering such a gruesome scene." Luke nodded. "It was scary, wasn't it, Ricky?" "Yeah," I agreed, "but we handled it like professionals." She chuckled. "I'm sure you did. I always knew that Tommy Dean was a rotten apple. I can't help but wonder what it was all for, though. Why sacrifice that little dog?" We looked at each other and shrugged, with mouthfuls of pie. "And those symbols, what did they mean?" "My dad said it was devil worship," said Luke. "I'm sure he's right," she said. "To think I'd only seen that poor dog a few hours before Tommy took him. I can't help but think I could have done something to help." "You couldn't have known, Miss Jacobs," I said. "It's not your fault." She patted my hand. "Thank goodness you heroes found those school books of his at the scene. Imagine what else he could have done if it weren't for you. I dread to think. Luke and I looked at each other and smiled with pride. "Excuse me a moment," she said. "I'll be right back." "We're heroes," I chuckled when she'd left the room. "We found the villain and saved the day," Luke giggled. As we kept tucking in, I couldn't help but feel like something wasn't quite right. Then it hit me. Wait, didn't Miss Jacobs say she hadn't seen Milo for a few days when we were investigating? He shrugged. "Yeah, so? But she just said she saw him a few hours before Tommy took him." His brow furrowed. "Oh yeah. She's an old lady though, Ricky. My grandma is very forgetful." I contemplated it, but it still didn't feel right. My eyes widened. "The sheriff's department didn't release the evidence," I said quietly. "How does she know about the books?" Luke's eyes widened to match mine as Miss Jacobs came back into the room. "Will you look at that?" she said. "You've almost finished your pie. Let me cut you another slice." "No," I said, clearing my throat. "It was delicious but very filling." "Very well," she smiled. "Let me take this dish away then." When she lifted the pie dish, Luke and I both stared in horror. Scratched in the wooden table were 3 triangles overlapping each other. "Oh yes," she said. "There was a mystery for you to solve. A mystery ingredient. I wonder if you've got the detective skills to work it out." Luke looked at me like he was about to cry, and I felt exactly the same. He coughed a little and put his fingers to his mouth, pulling something out. "What is it, Luke?" she said. He covered his mouth like he was about to puke. "Hair. Clue number 1, she said. "And you, Ricky?" I shook my head. "We'd like to leave now, Miss Jacobs." "Nonsense," she said. She took my plate away and put the pie dish in front of me. "Go on, have a look." I looked at Luke, who was clearly terrified. My hands were shaking as I picked up the fork and pulled pieces of pastry away. As I searched through the thick, dark purple filling, my fork made a clink sound. I picked it out with my fingers. I could instantly feel what it was. A long, canine tooth. I threw it across the table and pushed myself back, grabbing Luke's arm. As we made a run for the door, it slammed shut, and the light that had been coming through the windows dimmed. The symbol on the table began to glow as if it was drawn in embers. Luke and I had our arms around each other as we sniveled, not being able to comprehend what was happening. Miss Jacobs smiled from across the room, her hair flowing as if caught in a breeze. "What are your findings?" she asked. "The Brook Street sleuths must be able to figure it out." "You killed Milo," I shouted, and... The thought of it made me sick. "Bravo," she clapped. "Make the sacrifice, feed the innocent." "But why?" screamed Luke. "I am far older than any human should be," she cackled. "That takes a bit of dark magic to maintain." She grabbed Luke, and I tried to pull him away from her, but with a flick of her hand, I was forced against the wall. She threw him down onto the symbol, and he screamed out as smoke began to rise around him. "It burns," he screamed in pain. "Leave him alone," I cried. But she turned to me. The features that made her Miss Jacobs faded, revealing something ancient and decayed. Loose skin hung from visible bones, empty sockets, wispy strands of hair, teeth surrounded by split, leathery gums. "You're next, Ricky," she yelled, deep and demonic. Her mouth opened wide, and she took Luke's whole head inside. His arms and legs began to kick about as I could hear muffled groans coming from inside her. There were snapping sounds as part of her dislocated like a snake to swallow him whole. Before long, his shoulders could no longer be seen. She made greedy, guttural noises as she forced his body down her throat. I was paralyzed against the wall, forced to watch as my best friend was eaten alive. I could feel my mind snapping like her ancient bones. Luke's legs were still kicking as she reached his knees, and her long bony fingers gripped around his ankles to push the last bit of him inside. There came a loud bang, something that startled her as well as me. The door to the dining room flew open, and 3 officers burst into the room, led by Deputy Campbell. "Jesus," he yelled, taking aim at what was once Miss Jacobs. She retched, and Luke's whole body slipped out of her, collapsing on the table in a cocoon of translucent goo. I fell from the wall and hit the floor hard as the officers opened fire on her, forcing her back with a multi-layered scream. The window shattered and natural light poured in, making her scream even louder, as if burned by the rays. I ran to Luke and pulled him from the table, relieved when he was still breathing. The glowing symbol was fading, and with a final shriek, the former Miss Jacobs became a cloud of smoke that was seemingly sucked into the symbol. Then, everything went deathly silent for a few seconds. As it happened, Tommy Dean had managed to convince the sheriff to investigate Miss Jacobs. He insisted that he had seen her on his property, and that his satchel couldn't be found afterwards. Thank God he did, because Luke and I would not be here today if it wasn't for him. We carry the mental scars, but we live. Suffice to say, the Brook Street sleuths were no more after that day. I never grew out of my cartoon phase. From an early age, I was drawn into the colourful characters and upbeat voices. This is what led me to deep dive into the creative process behind them in my teenage years and pursue it as a career as an adult. When I landed my first animation job, it was a dream come true. I knew the hours were long, the time was thankless compared to the more public names that do the voices and direction. But this is what I wanted to do. However, as my time went on with a fresh startup, I started to notice something strange about my co-workers. For starters, the team was small. You would think this would be a bottleneck for output, but the team was efficient. They'd work late into the night and be there for days that they weren't scheduled. I never knew how early they showed up. All I knew was that it was earlier than me, no matter what time I started. This is often seen as a negative in the animation industry. Overworked and underpaid is a common sentiment. However, this wasn't some strong-arm move by management. It was completely voluntary. Whenever I asked any of them what they were working on, they'd be vague and quickly change the subject. This kind of evasive behavior was from the whole team. But the strangest one of all was the company's founder, a man named Mr. Jones. He was always in his personal office, door permanently closed besides his goings in and out, working on some exclusive project no one was allowed to see. And it seemed it was only me that was curious. He was a cold and calculating man, dead eyes, but he held himself in a strong manner. No matter how much I tried to justify this as him just carrying himself the way a leader should, I always got a strange feeling about him. As I continued to work with the other members, I quickly picked up on how talented they were. It was how we got away with such a small team despite the heavy amount of projects we took on. They were multi-specialists too. Colorists doing shading, the sound team picking up for the animation, tweeners pitching in for direction. There was never a dropped beat in the flow of work, which made me feel pale in comparison, having only specialized in animation. Despite their chemistry, everyone seemed distant, almost robotic. Communication was just one step away from non-verbal. The startup was advertised as new, but they acted like they'd been working together for a lifetime. The moment things began to unravel was when I had a meeting with the elusive Mr. Jones. I was summoned to his office to discuss a project I was working on. As I entered, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I felt this was all a facade to discuss my lack of chemistry with the team. This was the first time I'd seen anyone besides Mr. Jones enter what was deemed his space, and it was me that had the honor of crossing the threshold. Mr. Jones sat behind his desk, his eyes cold and calculating as he looked me up and down. He didn't say a word for several moments, and the silent beats were almost suffocating. If this was some kind of CEO scare tactic, it was working. Finally, he spoke. "I've been watching your progress on your project, and I must say that I'm impressed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your work is truly exceptional, and I think you have the potential to be one of our top animators." I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at his words. All the extra time the others put in, yet I was the one that stood out. It was a boost to my ego, to say the least. Maybe the others were spread too thin, covering for each other, and I managed to stand out in my one true field. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. "Thank you, Mr. Jones," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, yet polite. "I'm glad you're pleased with my work." "Oh, I'm more than pleased," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "In fact, I think that you're ready to take on a special project for me. A project that will take your skills to the next level and truly showcase your talent." I was about to ask him more about the project, but before he could speak, he stood up from his desk and walked over to me. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and I could feel his cold, clammy fingers gripping me tightly. "You will work on this project, and you will not speak of it to anyone outside this company," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Do you understand?" I nodded, feeling a sense of fear coursing through my veins. I didn't know what he was planning, and he gave no hints to what was about to come. Mr. Jones didn't make me sign any NDAs, but I still felt the pressure of legal come-down if I were to breach this verbal agreement. As I worked on the special project for Mr. Jones, I couldn't help but notice that there was something strange about the entire situation. For one, I was never allowed to see any of the final animations that were created by my new personal team. Whenever I asked about them, I was met with yet more vague answers and quickly redirected to another task. I tried to brush it off as just the way things were done at the company. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. I started to notice that the other members outside my team were acting strange as well. They were even more secretive than usual, and they always seemed to be on edge around me. I tried to talk to some of my co-workers about it, but they all shut me down. They told me that I just needed to focus on my work in a manner that was the closest to human from any of my interactions. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I knew that I needed to find out what was really going on, but I didn't know how. I was already making myself a target with my questions. I was stuck working on these special projects for Mr. Jones, and I was afraid of what would happen if I tried to dig too deep. Something I picked up after a few projects was that I never knew who the clients were that commissioned the animations, or where they were going once they were finished. Whenever I asked, I was yet again met with more avoidance. I added it to yet more things I'll never get to know, but I couldn't shake the growing curiosity behind this company. The questions that drew to the forefront of my thoughts was, what were these animations being used for? One day, while working on a project, I stumbled across a stack of papers on Mr. Jones's desk. It was a rare time I was permitted to enter his space, since there were some machines in there that had niche uses, and was tasked to get one. The papers were all invoices and receipts, and they were addressed to various government agencies from around the world. I was stunned. I knew the clients must have been high profile for the boss to make us churn them out with such urgency, but I didn't know it went this deep. With this snippet of an answer, a flood of more questions rushed at me, and it got torrential when I looked closer. The specific agencies listed were from branches I'd never heard of. Acronyms that weren't the obvious culprits to common online conspiracy theories. Names that sounded like something from a sci-fi movie. I quickly left with the equipment I needed and hushed up about it, having learned to stop asking questions at the workplace. When I got home, I searched all the names I could remember online, but nothing showed. I tried pairing it with the respective countries, and it still came up blank. I knew they must be real, because the animations had to be going somewhere. So, I tried the most direct answer I could think of. I made sure to remember a specific branch, one based in my own country. My plan was to call the public government number and ask to be put through to the specific branch. I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my chest. I was nervous. As the phone rang, I waited anxiously for someone to answer. When someone picked up, it was a polite woman asking how she could help me, and I nervously asked to be put through. Without a response, I was met with a strange clicking sound and a high-pitched tone. I was terrified. In a panic, I hung up the phone immediately. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that I needed to be careful. I didn't want to put myself in any real danger. I tried to think of more ideas and left it for the night. The next day, as soon as I showed up for work, Mr. Jones called me into his office. He straight away let me know that I was fired. He gave some vague reasons about my performance not being up to par, which I felt couldn't be true. I'd been praised not too long ago about my outstanding performance, and my workflow hadn't declined since working the new position. In fact, it might have improved. I immediately knew it was connected to the phone call I'd made. I was angry and upset at having lost my first animation job, but I knew there was nothing I could do. I packed up my things and left the office, feeling a sense of dread. As I left, I was watched by the others in a cold silence, their emotionless stares piercing through me, though not with inflictions of embarrassment, but rather a sense of malice. After being let go, I continued to look for a new job, but I struggled. I tried to use the old company as a reference, but quickly learned that it was impossible. When I called the company for a referral, the calls never went through. I went back to the office, but it was vacated. Not even a drop of ink was left. I searched online for more information, but the sites were now blank. It was as if the team never existed. I didn't know what was going on, so I tried to dig deeper and look for the clients that I remembered from the papers, but it was impossible. I tried to do research about my old animation company, trying to uncover what was really going on, but the more I looked, the more frustrated I became. They covered their tracks well. If I couldn't find anything out while working there, being this distant made everything much harder. Meanwhile, I was still on the hunt for a new job. I struggled to explain the gap in my work history between now and my education. Whenever I mentioned the company, potential employers would look at me with confusion. I started to feel like I was going crazy. However, one day, while I was being interviewed for another fresh animation team, I mentioned them again. The interviewer looked at me with skepticism and told me he hadn't heard of them before. I was getting frustrated and was about to explain further when a worker who was passing by overheard our conversation and nodded his head. I went on to bomb the interview as usual and left. When outside, the worker quickly rushed over to me and handed me a slip of paper with his contact information. "Please, you have to reach me," the worker said urgently. "I used to work there too," was all he said as he rushed back inside, leaving me standing there with a slip of paper in my hand. When I got home, I stared at the slip of paper that was given to me. It was obvious he did it all in a rush, as the paper was hastily ripped from one of the work documents he was carrying, and the penmanship had holes from how it was written, most likely on the palm of his hand. I didn't know if I could trust him, but if I wanted to investigate further, I knew I had to take the plunge. So I decided to take the risk and contact him. I sent him an email and waited anxiously for a response. A few hours later, I got an answer. All it contained was a link to a small website that documented one of the animations I'd briefly worked on. The website was some small conspiratorial site that looked like it was made with the most basic templates. But what I read was wild. It tried to correlate the animation releases to a major political event. A one-off is a coincidence, but every example given was so specific to each country and event. I now knew more, but I had no idea where to go from here. My curiosity was always thirsty, and this did nothing to quench it. I was craving more. After this, though, my attempts to contact the worker failed. I started to get worried, so I decided to try to call the company where the worker was from, hoping to find some new contact information. But when I dialed the number, I was met with a strange clicking sound and a high-pitched tone. I looked them up, and they too disappeared. After my attempts to contact the worker failed, things started getting weirder. My friends and family seemed to be avoiding me. Whenever I ran into them in town, they would walk away from me as if they didn't want to be seen with me. It was as if I'd somehow become a pariah, and the thought made me feel isolated and alone. Even when I went to the store to buy groceries, the cashiers would barely acknowledge me. They would wordlessly serve me and take my money, but they wouldn't make eye contact or engage in conversation. It was as if I was poisonous air, breath held until I was safely away, and the thought made me feel like I was losing my mind. And after everything, I was still unable to find any solid information on my own. Until one night, I was flipping through the channels while watching TV, and I came across an advertisement for a worldwide premiere of a new cartoon. The cartoon was going to be translated into multiple languages and broadcast around the world. And as I watched the advertisement, I recognized some of the countries listed. They were the same countries that were listed on the papers I had found on Mr. Jones's desk. My eyes widened. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is going to happen. The worldwide premiere of the new cartoon is fast approaching. I don't know what kind of effect this cartoon is going to have on its viewers, but it's going to be something that's going to happen on a grander scale than anything we had done before. I can't help but worry about the future. We'd all heard the urban legends, heeded the warnings, followed the rules to a T. Well, most of us, that is. Christian and I weren't like normal kids. We were always getting into trouble, from playing hooky, to shoplifting, to going on joyrides. We did it all. We were without a doubt the most despised preteens in town. Little did we know, all that mischief would inevitably lead us to the worst day of our lives. God, I wish I could take it back. People in my town were always very superstitious. Not like, oh, you spilled the salt, throw a pinch over your left shoulder superstitious. No. Something happened here a long time ago. Something sinister. Something that still bears its burden on the townsfolk half a century later. You see, back in the 70s, kids started going missing. The disappearances always occurred at night. Always. And always in the same fashion. Parents would lock their homes down tighter than Fort Knox, only to find the front door hanging wide open the following morning. The kidnappings were beginning to pile up at the same time that nightly reports of an ice cream truck circling neighborhoods began to flood into the police station. Every time the authorities were called, the truck would be gone when they arrived, no matter the response time. The strange thing was, we didn't have an ice cream truck in the 70s. Hell, we still don't. This has always been the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and none of the families in town have ever owned an ice cream truck. Naturally, people began to associate the truck with the disappearances. Obviously, people tried to catch the mysterious abductor behind the wheel. That's when the adults started going missing. No one who ever confronted the driver was ever seen again. The fear was beginning to reach a boiling point. People panicked. Families with children started packing their things. Even some people without families at all were looking at relocating. And then, just when nearly half the population was about to split, it stopped. The almost nightly kidnappings, the sightings of the ice cream truck, all of it. The townsfolk never truly recovered. I mean, how could they after that? Most families of the victims moved away, eventually losing any hope of ever seeing their loved ones again. Can't say I blame them. I wouldn't have stuck around after that either. The ones who did stay grew paranoid, so they did everything in their power to ensure that nothing similar would ever happen again. That unfortunately manifested into an extremely strict set of rules. Girls aren't allowed to walk anywhere alone. The doors and windows to every house must remain locked at all times. And of course, no one is allowed outside after dark for any reason. The town shuts down well before sundown as a not-so-subtle reminder. Growing up, I always thought the stories were nonsense. I thought it was just another lazy excuse for parents to keep a close eye on their children, to prevent us from causing mayhem. I should have listened. Sarah, for the last time, I'm not sneaking out with you tonight. You know the rules, Christian whispered, tapping the eraser on his pencil against his notebook absent-mindedly. Come on, this is the one rule we haven't broken yet. You spray-painted Officer Dawkins' police cruiser, and this is what you're afraid of? I'm not scared. This is different. It's something sacred. You've lived here for just as long as I have. You should know that. he hissed, pretending to dial into Mrs. Huckabee's mind-numbing lecture on mitosis. Aren't you at least a little curious? You can't seriously tell me you've never wondered about going out at night. There's got to be something more than they're letting on. Sarah, I'm not going with you. If you want to risk your life by going out after dark, go right ahead, but leave me out of it, Christian said with a stern finality in his tone. I'd never seen him so serious about anything before, and that frightened me. We muddled through the remainder of the class in silence. Christian gave me the cold shoulder all day. I was beginning to wonder if I'd overstepped. I'll give it some time to blow over. I had just finished cramming my textbooks into my locker when Christian approached me. I jumped, nearly dropping my backpack. I hadn't expected to see him again that day. What's up, dude? Thought you were going to make me walk home alone. He locked eyes with me, sending a chill creeping up my spine. A bitter determination was scrawled across his visage. I'll go with you. I was taken aback. He'd been so adamant earlier. What changed? Are you sure? I mean, I don't want you to go if you're not comfortable with it. I'm sure. I have to know, he said, averting his gaze. Okay, we'll meet at your house at midnight. Sound good? Yeah, Christian sheepishly glanced up at me. And you didn't seriously think I'd let you walk home by yourself, did you? I giggled, flashing him a grin. No, I guess I didn't. Christian was seemingly back to his old self on the way home from school. I listened intently as he babbled on about his latest revenge scheme. He was planning on setting off a fart bomb in Becky Nelson's locker for snitching on him. I didn't care if I was being suckered into another one of his devious pranks. I was just happy that things were back to normal between us. I'm gonna make her pay, Christian hissed, smashing his fist into his palm. Can't wait to see the look on her ugly-ass face. Anyway, I'll see you tonight, I said as I trudged up my driveway. You bet. We waved goodbye to each other, and I watched as Christian continued down the sidewalk. Midnight couldn't come quickly enough. I giddily awaited nightfall. I felt as though my heart would burst from my chest at any given moment. My adrenaline always spiked before one of our little misadventures. I was watching the time like a hawk. My parents had already turned in for the night, so I was left to my own devices. That was a dangerous game. My eyes were glued to the numbers on my phone screen. 11:58 p.m. It was so close. And that's when I heard it. Clunk. Something hard pelted my window. My eyes grew wide, and a smile inched across my lips as I raced to the source. Christian was standing outside, his arms cocked like a quarterback. Oh, there you are. Hey, he said, dropping the rock in his hand. Dude, you scared the hell out of me. Weren't we supposed to meet at your place? And why didn't you just text me like a normal person? Sorry, I got restless, he muttered, staring at his feet. My parents took my phone last week, remember? Oh yeah, not sure how I forgot. Coming down, I said, cautiously climbing out and steadying myself on the stepladder that I'd strategically placed below my window. I hopped down from the last step, landing in the grass with a soft thump. Ready? I said, eager to set off. Yeah, let's go, Christian said, taking my hand. I blushed, and he quickly recoiled. Even in the dim yellow light provided by the street lamps, I could tell that his face was bright red. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I just want to get going is all. No, you're good. I get it. There was a long, awkward pause before Christian spoke up. So, where are we going? I don't know. I hadn't thought this far ahead. Where do you want to go? How about the park? Might be kind of fun with no kids around. The park it is. Lead the way, I said, dramatically extending my arm. A big goofy grin plastered itself on Christian's face as he willingly obliged. We walked in silence, drinking in the scene around us. We passed by dozens of houses, their looming presence lending an unsettling air to the stillness of the night. The faint light cast an eerie glow that glinted off their windows, making my blood run cold. Another strange thing I noticed was that it was deathly quiet. The only sounds we heard were our own light footfalls against the pavement and the blood rushing in our ears. There were no noises from creatures of the night, no bugs, no frogs, nothing. We couldn't even hear any crickets chirping, and that sent a chill down my spine. I was sweating bullets by the time we arrived at the playground. Christian looked unfazed, but I highly suspected that he was putting on a front. Don't get me wrong, Christian was one tough cookie, but truth be told, I was the braver of the two of us. Usually, if I was feeling on edge, he'd be 10 times worse off. We plopped down on adjacent swings. I cringed as the rusted metal swing set creaked and groaned under our weight. Even though we were alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, like something sinister knew we were there. I shuddered at the thought that something evil might be lurking in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I told myself that I was freaking out over nothing, but I couldn't stop intermittently peeking into the shadow-veiled trees behind us. I was seriously beginning to regret leaving the safety of my home. So, Sarah, is it just me, or is this place, this town, does it feel like there's a presence? You know, like we're not the only ones out here. He kept his voice hushed, like he was afraid that someone else would hear him. Yeah, I feel it too. It's really creepy, I said, sensing the oppressive weight of that feeling slightly lift from my shoulders. It was nice to know that Christian felt it too. Christian stared off into the mulch at our feet. He looked lost in thought, as if his body was there, but his mind was in some far-off dimension. You know, I wasn't originally planning to come with you. There's a reason I chose to come out tonight. He sighed, a wary ambition written across his features. There was something he was hiding from me, but I could sense that he was slowly mustering up the courage to tell me what it was. So, I know you've all heard the stories about the ice cream truck that went around abducting kids in the 70s, and I know that you think it's all a pile of steaming nonsense, but it's not. He paused, searching my face for a reaction. How can you be so sure? We weren't alive back then, so... My uncle was one of the children who were kidnapped. My heart plummeted into my gut. Not for the fact that Christian was related to someone who was taken, but that the stories were... true. Christian, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. It's okay, he said, interrupting me again. He was 3 when it happened. It's been decades, but I don't think Dad ever really forgave himself. He was only 5 at the time, but he feels like he should have done more. He won't tell me that, but I know. I can see it in his eyes. It still tears him up, even now. A tear began to trickle down Christian's cheek, but he quickly swiped it away. I know it's stupid of me, but I just had to know if it was true. If that thing was still around, I was honestly sort of hoping that it would be. I know I don't stand much of a chance at killing whoever's behind it, but this might help a bit, right? He cracked a smile and flashed a sharp, black switchblade. Yeah, I think that would help your chances a bit, I chuckled. You know I wouldn't let you fight alone either. Hate to burst your bubble though. I don't think we'll run into that thing tonight. Yeah, you're probably right, Christian said, standing from his swing. Let's go home. Works for me. I've seen enough. I joined him, and we began to make our way back towards our houses. We'd only made it to the street when I heard it. A jingle. The sound sliced through the silence like a rusty knife. It was slow, melodic, but something about it was wrong. Christian and I glanced at each other, eyes wide as saucers. My heart thumped furiously against my chest as it grew closer. It blared the tune of London Bridge is Falling Down, intertwined with the sound of a jack-in-the-box cranking up, sending waves of panic rippling through me at every interval. And then it slowly rolled into view. A white truck rounded the corner to the street we were standing on. A comically large pink ice cream cone was perched atop it, facing the sky like a rocket ready for liftoff. The windows were tinted to the point that I couldn't see who or what was behind the wheel. I wanted to run, to scream, to hide, anything. But I was paralyzed with fear. The truck crept closer and closer. Dread seeped into my bones. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, it passed. I gawked at it, drinking in all the different selections pasted on the side. And then it stopped, directly in front of us. The music cut out, bathing the night in that all-encompassing silence. My breath hitched in my throat, waiting for something to happen. Without warning, the back doors of the ice cream truck swung open. I looked at Christian. His horrified expression had melted into one of curiosity. He began to make his way toward the open truck. His legs moved like they had a mind of their own, dragging himself closer and closer. To this day, I don't know why, but I didn't even try to stop him. No. I joined him. I can't explain it, but there was something alluring about that truck, something that effortlessly took hold of me and pulled me in, and I was powerless to stop it. We both tentatively walked closer, coming to a halt directly behind it. I peered inside, my mouth agape. It was spotless. A sparkling white interior with rows upon rows of freezers shined inside. It boasted every flavor of ice cream you could imagine. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to step into the back of that truck and try every variation of ice cream it had to offer. Nothing bad would happen. It was just an ice cream truck after all. Christian stepped in before I could react. He turned back to me, outstretching a hand to hoist me up. I didn't even have a chance to take it. The door suddenly slammed shut, locking Christian inside. I'll never forget the look of abject fear on his face in that split second before the doors closed. I was ripped from my stupor as the ice cream truck floored it down the road. Its tires squealed as it went, leaving me standing alone under a street lamp. I broke down, fat tears streaming down my cheeks as I bolted home. I couldn't lose Christian. He was the only real friend I'd ever had. I burst through my front door, spewing nonsense to my parents as I crumpled to the ground at their feet. I didn't care if I'd get in trouble anymore. I just wanted to find a way to bring my friend back. The police were called. Christian's parents were notified, and a search party was assembled. I don't think I need to tell you that they didn't find him. Christian is still missing to this day. I was never the same after that. It didn't matter how much time passed, how many therapy sessions I attended, how hard I tried to forget. That image of Christian's terrified face is still burned into my memory. But there's something that chills me even more than that look of pure dread scrawled across my best friend's countenance. Something that I still can't comprehend. When I peered into the back of that ice cream truck, there was no one behind the wheel. So, why am I telling you this? Why now? Well, my son went missing last night. I awoke with a start next to my snoring husband. A sinking pit of dread sank into my stomach when that horrible tune met my ears. London Bridge is falling down. I raced to the front door. It was wide open. I watched helplessly as my baby boy climbed into the back of that truck. I couldn't even scream. I was rooted in fear, just like I had been on that night 2 decades ago. A surge of panic coursed through my veins like venom. Because, as the ice cream truck sped away with my child, I noticed that the window was rolled down. And I swear, for a split second, I saw Christian wink at me from the driver's seat. I'm never quite sure if I was just stupid when I missed the signs, or if I'm just a normal person. Sarah was very sweet on the surface. She ticked all the boxes, even if she was a bit awkward. But so what? People are awkward. I tried to look past the little things. I mean, we can all be a bit weird, can't we? Especially when we get nervous. But Sarah was odd in a way that, in hindsight, maybe I should have taken more seriously. On their own, all the little signs seemed quite innocuous. At the start, she was very hands-on during dates, pinching and grabbing and winking. She'd make these hilarious innuendos and constantly toe the line of what was and wasn't appropriate. I like a woman with a dark sense of humor, and she had that in spades. But she pulled away if I tried to reciprocate, and I realized early on that intimacy wouldn't be on the cards for a long time. And I was fine with that. I wasn't in a hurry. And yet, she continued to send mixed signals. She'd ask for photos almost every night. Girls don't normally ask for full length. It was weird, and taking a good picture wasn't as easy as I thought it'd be. I always thought I looked weird in that kind of full-body vertical picture. But she was always happy with what I sent. She had a lot of requests. One was to see me lying on the floor, eyes closed, arms to either side of my back. She liked that one. One time she made me do a striptease with a white sheet, slowly pulling it down in one picture after the other. This went on for the first month, I'd say. I sent her pictures, she sent me some. We talked a lot about what we each wanted. It was kind of fun and kinky, like we were taking turns being each other's long-distance model. And as a guy, I don't usually get to enjoy the feeling of being a promiscuous object. I normally feel like my sexiness is tied to some kind of performance. It was novel and exciting to be valued as just a physical being. I never really figured I had an exhibitionist streak, or that was something that women wanted much of. But she did, and I didn't dislike it. During all this, we continued to meet up once or twice a week for food. It seemed like we had a little thing going that might one day become something real. We never did spend the night together. First time I thought it was going to happen was after I sent a photo of me lying on my kitchen floor, the white towels freezing my ass the whole time. An hour after I sent the photo, she appeared on my doorstep without warning, hair soaking wet and smelling of booze. As soon as she saw me, she grabbed me, guided me to the sofa, then climbed on top and started kissing me, hard. She was handsy, but it never went past over the clothes stuff. Just hot, heavy and, well, not all that good. Do you ever wonder if some people are bad at intimacy stuff because no one tells them the truth? It was like she was trying to suck the air out of my lungs. I've had better kisses off my dog. She got a lot of points for enthusiasm, don't get me wrong. I've never had anyone grope me and touch me with such raw passion before. But whenever I tried to match her energy, I got the sense she didn't really care for it. She never reacted or moaned or gave off non-verbal cues to be like, do that more. It was all about her touching me, never vice versa. After maybe 20 minutes of this over the clothes fumbling, she asked me to lie down on the floor. I had no idea where this was going, so I did. Can you hold your breath? She asked as she looked down at me. All of a sudden, I felt very small, and there were lots of thoughts going through my head. I'm pretty sure there was nothing I wouldn't have done for her in that moment, although not necessarily because I wanted to. There was just an intensity to her stare that shrunk me down until I was the size of an ant. So, I held my breath. I held it so long my lungs burned and my head swam until I couldn't do it any longer. When I opened my eyes, she was looking down at me with so much hunger in her eyes, I actually got a little scared. Admittedly, I sort of liked it. She paused for a moment, drinking me in, and then said she'd better get going. She had work in the morning. We kissed at the door, and a hand roamed all over my back. I was cold by that point, and her hands felt so warm. I swore something was about to happen, but she simply left me standing there. It was confusing and frustrating, so much so I almost didn't call her back. But she had a kind of commanding energy about her, a deep awareness of what she did and didn't want, that it was just enough for me to keep replying to her texts. After that night, I always laid on my kitchen floor when she asked for a photo, but it never really had the same effect of getting her to my doorstep. Still, she became a regular fixture in my life, and pretty soon I hoped we might get close to something a bit more serious. I looked for signs that she thought the same thing, but the going was damn slow. By the time winter rolled around, we'd been on and off for 6 months, and just about the only thing that actually changed was the way she kept holding my hand. She'd take my cold hands between her own and hold them against her cheek, her neck, maybe even her chest. At times, it was quite nice. It took a while, but I managed to swing her around into another home visit. You can guess what I was hoping for. But she actually made us spend most of our time out on the balcony watching the stars, cuddling together in the freezing cold. She made me give her my jacket as well, even when I offered to get her one from inside. It had to be the one I was wearing, and she wouldn't let me replace it. By the time we went back in, I felt like I was close to getting pneumonia, and the shock of the warm air left me feeling dizzy. "Lie down," she begged me. "Lie on the floor. I have an idea." I was shaking by this point, the tips of my fingers ice blue. When she came back over, she had a glass of red wine. She stood over me, warming the glass in her hands, before giving me clear instruction. "Sip some," she said, "and keep it in your mouth. Close your eyes, don't open them, and don't swallow the wine." I don't even like wine, and I was pretty irritated by the whole thing. But there was a tension in the air, something about her electric anticipation that infected me. I didn't know what was happening, and in the past, when I felt that way, it sometimes led to me having new and exciting experiences. Out of nowhere, she kissed me, pushing her tongue into the lukewarm wine until it dribbled messily out of the corners of my lips. At the same time, and in one swift motion, she pressed the heel of her hand into my diaphragm and pushed so hard that the wine gushed out of my mouth and into hers. I started coughing. She did too. My immediate reaction was that kind of irritation you can't hide. It actually ticked me off. It was surprising in all the wrong ways, and given what I maybe hoped was coming, it just meant all the disappointment turned into outright frustration. All I'd wanted was a normal kiss, some sign of basic, normal affection. Did she even realize how terrible I felt after freezing my ass off on the balcony so she could feel like some gentleman was giving her my jacket? I pushed her off me, gently but firm. "Let's not do that again," I said, choking at the words. "What were you trying to do?" "Nothing," she cried. "It was nothing, just something different." She seemed sincerely regretful and sorry, but I was half naked, horny, irritated, and freezing cold. I didn't ask her to leave, but she clearly sensed the change in atmosphere and made some excuse. I wiped myself down while she went to the toilet, and when she emerged, I greeted her with a handbag and keys. I didn't even walk her to the door. Instead, as she looked at me with a sort of sad pout from the door, I simply ignored her and began to mop the kitchen floor. "Looks like a damn murder scene," I grumbled. She may have said something before she left, but I didn't look up until I heard the door close. After that, we didn't speak for a while. Now, this is a very typical thing for me to do, but over the next few days, I did a little retrospective on our dates and realized I'd been the one putting in all the work. It was always me escalating, asking for dates, phone calls, trying to move things between us forward. I figured if there was any chance of a real relationship, then she'd have to just come back and apologize and explain her behavior and be the one to reach out for once. Of course, at the exact same time, I couldn't get her out of my head. Maybe she'd just been clumsy, I thought. Maybe she was nervous. I couldn't get my head around the wine thing. It seemed so random. I'm more familiar with the usual BDSM stuff people like. If I could have pinned her actions down to some specific kink, I could have more confidently figured if we were compatible or not. But without more information, I was just well and truly confused. I wanted to like her, but if there was no chance of us working out, if we were just incompatible, then I wanted closure. As it was, I didn't have a clue what we were or what the hell we'd been doing. Either way, when she finally texted asking if I'd like to pick her up after work, I agreed. I wanted closure and maybe I imagined it, but something about her tone seemed a little contrite. That feeling was reinforced when I met her in the parking lot of the hospital where she worked, and I found her sitting on the hood of a car in a breathtaking red dress. As soon as I was out of the car, she took my hand and told me she'd set up a little date for us, something special, and that she'd finally make it all up to me. The way she kissed me, the way she guided my hand along her waist, there was something so utterly different about it, so committed, that I immediately knew she wanted to go the whole way. I could just tell she'd finally made a decision. A threshold had been crossed, and I wanted to go see where this would lead. She didn't work at the hospital itself, but rather took me off to a building on the same grounds. It was a quiet little red brick thing, just 2 floors from the outside, and I wondered what it was exactly that she did. Inside, there was a chemical smell that was pretty overwhelming, but at first glance, it seemed like a simple GP office. There was a little reception area with 1 or 2 chairs, a small countertop with some computers and a bunch of back offices. This was after hours, so no one else was there. Only a few dim lights in the reception area. Everywhere else was dark. She quickly disappeared upstairs, telling me she was going to slip into something more comfortable, and I settled down for a short wait. At least she locked the door behind us so no one else could come in. I took that as a good sign, but I still felt pretty uncertain. Where were we? And why the hell did she pick this place for our date? I tried to sit down, but it felt too strange, like waiting for the dentist, so I stood and shuffled around a bit instead, listening to the muffled thumps of whatever the hell she was doing upstairs. Outside, it was starting to get dark. Fewer and fewer cars were going past, and it was raining heavily, all of which made that little room feel even like a lonely little corner of the world. Well hidden and out of the way, even though the hospital was clearly visible with heavy traffic not far behind it. There wasn't much else to do except snoop, and I quickly noticed the door had been left slightly ajar, like someone had forgotten to shut it. It was the only door I could reach without climbing over something. So, my curiosity got the better of me. I approached it and got maybe 2 feet away before I realized it was the source of that damn chemical smell. Once I realized that, I had to take a look inside, just so I could know for sure what the hell it was. I tried pushing it open an inch or 2 and peeking inside, but it was pitch black in there, so I pushed it open a little further, and using my phone light, I saw that there were a set of stairs going down into a basement. More thumps from upstairs told me she wasn't going to come down anytime soon. I had time to check, so I went down a step and tried seeing if that helped, but there was nothing. So I went down another and then another, until suddenly a set of automatic lights came on with a loud thunk and the rising whine of fluorescence coming to life. I'm not sure what I expected, but what I saw. At first, it left me dumbstruck, but then, I don't know. It was a sterile room with white speckled tiles, a few countertops running along the walls covered in silver instruments I didn't recognize. One wall covered in a regular grid of metal cupboard doors, and 3 steel slabs in the center of the room. One of them was occupied, a vaguely human shape covered by a white shroud, a lone foot of a man sticking out at the bottom. Something about the strange coloring and texture of the skin immediately let me know he wasn't having a nap. That and the toe tag was a pretty obvious clue. It was a morgue. She worked in the morgue, and it was here of all places she'd decided to set our final date. My initial reaction was to want to go upstairs and confront her, get angry, let it out, and just leave after making her unlock the door. But something stopped me. I can't say for sure what. As quickly as it came, the anger left me, and I was left with a kind of horrified curiosity, an idea I couldn't even put to words in the privacy of my own head. Instead of turning around and leaving, I waited a few seconds to make sure she wasn't coming down right behind me, and I began to descend the rest of the way. The walk to the body felt like a 10-mile hike. Every step was too loud, every breath a nervous shivering exhalation that felt like it might burst into a gasp at any moment. I was terrified. I couldn't help but imagine that faceless shape turning to look at me or sitting upright in one smooth motion. I quickly realized why ghosts are stereotypically portrayed as walking sheets. Someone must have had the same thought I had. The imagined scene of a shroud-covered body moving swiftly towards you in the dark. Hell of a time for my brain to play those kinds of games with me. But that curiosity drove me on. I couldn't walk away. Not now. Before I knew it, I was stood by the body, and with a shaking hand, I pulled back the sheet. He looked like me. Vaguely. I think we would have probably been a close match before the bloating. Same hair color, same face shape, same ethnicity, age, so on. For a moment, I considered the idea that maybe Sarah was just a very weird woman. People get desensitized to this kind of stuff all the time, and to her, the building we were in might just be a nice empty place to bring a date. But that body on that slab, I don't know how to describe it, but it set something off in me. A kind of slow, rising dread. I'm not sure why I did what I did next, but I couldn't stop thinking of that strange night when she pushed against my chest and sent wine dribbling out my mouth. So utterly bizarre, but maybe. I placed my hand against the man's cold flesh, heel to the diaphragm, and applied pressure. He animated like a puppet. A brief gasp of air, followed by curdled blood flowing out of his mouth, black and yellow and red. Pallets, platelets, and plasma separated with time into a thick soup. When the smell hit me, I couldn't help but be sick. And as I hunched over the nearby drain and emptied my body of all my vomit and bile, images of my time with Sarah flashed through my mind. The photos of me nude lying on the white tile floor, the use of the blanket to cover my chest, her fixation on my cold hands, a night spent freezing on my balcony, filling my mouth with wine and forcing it back out with a shove to the chest. I looked at the body and quickly understood how and why she discovered what happens when you apply pressure to the chest. The image was crystal clear in my mind. The mental image of a slender frame straddling the bloated man before me was as unpleasant and inescapable as nails on a chalkboard. Unable to shake it, I hunched over once more and was sick again. This time until my eyes watered and there was nothing left but saliva and bile. I felt violated. I wanted to leave. I no longer felt angry or confused. Instead, every moment of the last 6 months fell into place and a pattern emerged that terrified me. She wasn't meandering or clueless. Everything she'd done had been moving towards this one night with me here, locked in this place with no one to call for help. I'd blundered into what might just be the most dangerous situation of my life. And now, I was too deep into the trap to just blindly panic. Underground and in a room with only one exit. I had to be careful. She was up there somewhere, maybe clueless about what I'd realized, maybe not. She seemed small enough, but a cursory glance at some of the glinting blades on the nearby work surface told me she didn't have to be a bodybuilder to hurt me. Any one of those razor-sharp instruments could work its way into the meat of my neck with very little effort. Sooner or later, she'd realize where I was. Sooner or later, this plan of hers had to have an endgame. I looked up the stairs. If she came down from the top floor, she'd see the lights from this room, and it would be obvious to anyone where I'd gone. I was torn. Do I go up and pretend I saw nothing? I thought about having to go up there and lie my way through some awkward encounter. "Oh, I'm feeling a little unwell. I have to skip." Polite smile, nod. Could I stomach even that brief exchange? And that's if she bought it. And it required that the next step of a plan involved me conscious or alive. I thought of her attacking me out of nowhere with a scalpel, silently dragging it across my throat, letting that surgical blade bite into cartilage. She was small, but so what? I had no idea what she was planning or where she was lurking. Walking into an ambush and toughing it out didn't seem like the best of plans. What I wanted was distance. I just needed a door or a window. I just had to avoid her. My first instinct had been to get out of the basement, and I wanted to go with it. But the strange sounds coming from upstairs made me think she might have finally come to find reception empty. Terrified, I looked around desperate for some way out, or maybe even a good hiding spot. Just about every bad idea you can think of went through my head, including swapping myself out for the corpse. I nearly laughed at the stupidity of it, but my attention had been pulled to the morgue drawers, and with a sinking feeling in my gut, I slowly realized there was nowhere else in that room large enough to hide a person. "Michael?" The voice was muffled and distant, but I could tell she was finally looking for me. This was really fast becoming a now or never moment. With a deep breath, I pulled at the first drawer I saw and felt bittersweet relief that it was empty. I wasn't sure I could go through with this, but at least it hadn't been already occupied. With a rising gorge, I climbed inside feet first, slid myself back into the darkness, trying my best not to think of a pair of cold hands snatching my ankles, and then quickly pulled the door shut. I'd barely heard it click when there came the sound of footsteps down the stairs. They stopped halfway, and I clearly heard a hiss, "Damn," under her breath, before turning back around and returning upstairs. She must have figured I'd seen the bodies and run off somewhere else. Wherever that might take her, it had at least brought me time. I opened the door using the internal latch while pushing aside morbid questions of why that feature was even necessary, and stepped out as quietly as I could onto the tile steps. After that, I scaled the stairs as silently as I could manage and made my way to the door at the top of the basement. She had thankfully left it ajar once again. Bit of a habit of hers, I assumed, and peeked through into the darkness beyond. In the time I'd been in the basement, the sun had fully set, and now there were only the lights of passing cars to illuminate reception. Bright amber lights with hard edges swept across the room, one after the other, with strange irregularity. They made for an unpredictable insight into the room's components. A chair, a computer, a countertop. I had to squint and wait patiently for a few of them to go by before I realized one of the back office's doors were open, and there was the sound of frustrated footsteps coming from within. She was distracted, and this was my best chance of getting out. I tiptoed out of the basement and listened carefully. She occasionally hissed an angry refrain to herself, opening what sounded like cabinet doors. "Why are you doing this, Michael?" she whined. And I was surprised that she sounded not malevolent, but sad and pitiful, like an upset teenager. She was genuinely confused by my reaction. For a brief moment, I dared to wonder if my imagination had gotten the better of me. Right there on the counter was a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Maybe she really was just intending for a normal date, and I'd made connections that were never really there. But in my mind, I saw that corpse bloated and bloody once again, and ultimately decided I was better safe than sorry. A quick check of the front door showed it was still locked, and so, with nowhere else to go, I went up another floor, careful to stop every step or two and listen for signs she had changed course. Thankfully, I was at the top step by the time I heard her leave the office and enter another. "Come on," she cried. "Why are you being like this?" I wasn't sure what my game plan was. I figured my best chance was a window and was already trying to start tearing the top floor apart when I was stopped dead in my tracks by what I saw. There were a few rooms on the top floor, but only one of them had an open door and the lights turned on. What I saw inside hit me so hard I stopped dead in my tracks and let out a gasp. It was covered in plastic wrap, top to bottom, floors, walls and ceiling. A small white table had been set up in one corner, and on it lay 3 open pill bottles, a hacksaw and several scalpels. Seeing all that stuff, getting such an upfront sight into what she had planned, it all made my damn skin crawl. That and a bottle of lotion made me want to be sick. Suppressing the urge to gag, I decided none of that really mattered because, and this wasn't a great surprise, she had picked a room with a large and easy to open window. I pushed aside the plastic sheeting and opened it to find the drop below wasn't anywhere near as bad as the thought of spending another second in that damn room. I began to climb out, got one leg through, carefully balancing so that if I fell, I'd minimize injury. When I heard a sound by the door, the crinkling of plastic, the gentle glide of a door. I turned and saw her standing in the dark hallway beyond. It was hard to see, but she wasn't grinning like a maniac or waiting with a knife. More than anything, she just looked disappointed, maybe even frustrated. In hindsight, it made sense. She'd spent a long time setting this up. Not just the room with the plastic sheeting, but the entire relationship had been built carefully around that night. I expected her to crack, break, come at me screaming and slashing with some hidden blade. But she only shook her head and quietly mewed, "It's not my fault." I considered a reply, but found none to be fitting. I jumped and landed safely below with a bit of a knee-shaking thump. Nowhere near as bad as the shin-splintering worst-case scenario I kept imagining. Then, with a deep breath, relishing the smell of fresh air, I ran as quickly as I could towards the hospital and the lot where my car waited. You know, you might not be too surprised to learn this, but there wasn't actually much I could prove when it was all over. By the time the police visited the morgue, it was apparently back to normal. Her side of the story was that I'd insisted on visiting the morgue out of curiosity and got upset when she didn't want to stick around. It was kind of hard to prove anything else. I had no injuries, no evidence of intent, or anything else other than a suspicion of some pretty messed up behavior. In the end, the best the police were willing to do was hook me up with a lawyer who dealt with restraining orders, and he told me I need some evidence of actual harassment. Well, that, and the main gist of his advice was actually for me to stay away from her because, if anything, it'd be a hell of a lot easier for her to convince people I was the problem and not the other way around. I didn't have much choice in the end, except to move on. And all told, I was just happy to have made it out alive, even if the thought of her out there made me deeply anxious. I had to assume she'd go looking for another target since I'd wised up, although I hoped that maybe the close encounter with me would stop her from trying again. As for me, I deleted my Tinder profile, having decided that internet dating will never be a thing for me again. But the nightmares persist, and I often think of her standing there in the doorway. She didn't look half as upset as I might have thought. The whole thing was like I'd been a bit naughty. There she was, an aspiring murderer moments away from executing a plan that had been months in the making. And she'd stood there like it was all nothing but a minor setback. It just didn't make sense. And like everything with Sarah, I struggled to move on from this peculiar behavior until I got an answer. Well, today I finally got it when I woke up and felt something strange by my feet. I pulled back the sheets and saw something that made my heart sink and a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I was wearing a toe tag. I think I might have underestimated her patience, and I am starting to appreciate just why she found that night in the morgue to be a little more than a setback. On the tag itself, my name is scrawled on one line, and on the date of death below, she had simply written, "In just a few days." I got a job in San Diego not too long after the pandemic settled. It was an exciting time, but I was also anxious about finding a place to live. I didn't have that much saved up, so I had to find somewhere a bit more lenient to newcomers. I signed up to all kinds of lists and tenant groups, but most leads were dead in the water. The only places within my price range had a no pets policy, and I couldn't bring myself to rehome my cat, Marmalade. Poor thing was just a year old and a complete mama's girl. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a landlord with a vacant spot. He hadn't even got the time to list it. All I'd seen was a post about a cheap apartment. I messaged him spontaneously and asked about it. Turns out the previous tenant had passed away. It was on the 4th floor, not too far off Main Street, and surprisingly cheap. Cat-friendly too. He offered me a deal. If I paid for the cleanup crew, the place was mine. I couldn't say no. Once the place was cleaned up, I met up with my new landlord and got the keys handed to me. My new place was on the top floor of this beautiful old building made somewhere back in the 50s. Cool stone-tiled floors, spacious ceiling, and plenty of sunlight coming in from the body-sized windows. There was a sort of French balcony with a little space to smoke or a mini garden. There was a large living room area, a tiny kitchenette, and a cramped little bedroom on the sunny side. It wasn't much, but I could see myself growing attached to it. You could tell it was old though. There were all kinds of little quirks. A lock that you had to jiggle, pipes that rumbled a little whenever you took a shower, and you could immediately tell if one of your neighbors was smoking because of the terrible ventilation. It was far from perfect, but for that price, At that location, I couldn't ask for a better deal. The one thing that dated it more than anything else, however, was the strange 70s wallpaper. This intricate floral pattern covered most of the living room, along with the western wall of the bedroom, a dark grey base colour with lines of white, rose, tulips, sunflowers, all in variations of silver and blue. It was beautiful, in a sort of primitive Art Deco kind of way, but you could tell it was old. I promised myself to get it replaced if I were to live there long term. It didn't take long to move in. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, and I didn't really have the money to bring in something new. I figured I'd settle for what little I had for the time being, instead of focusing on getting used to my new job. I was working as a full-time consultant for a telecom company, mostly focusing on process management and evaluation. Might not sound that interesting, but you get a lot of wiggle room to really switch things up for the better. Post-pandemic, we were on a routine of a single weekly meeting, and the rest could, and would, be done from our home office. It felt kind of dumb to force people to come in once a week just because, but if I wanted the job, that was the deal. Marmalade got settled in that place long before I did. She found a sunny spot next to one of the big windows. I set up a cozy basket for her to snuggle into. I, on the other hand, was having trouble sleeping those first few nights. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd lose myself in that view, sort of like when you're looking down into dark waters. You can't really see where it ends. It is just this perpetual nothing. And you can imagine it continuing forever. That first week went by in a flash. I had my first meeting and got my first assignment, process assessment at one of the branch offices in Pittsburgh, long distance, with an in-person evaluation at the end of a 2-month cycle. Nothing I couldn't handle. But said office had a sort of reputation for being unmanageable. It was the kind of assignment you throw at someone to see if they got the chops for it long term. That first day was mostly meet and greets, with a tiny after work at one of the chic downtown bars. It was mostly an excuse to crack a few cold ones on a Monday. My colleagues were a few decibels louder than I was used to, so I ended up sitting mostly in the background, learning to appreciate a small label dark pumpkin ale. The next day, I was in full work mode. I set up my laptop with a view of my awful wallpaper to make it look a bit more office-like. Marmalade wasn't moving from a new favourite spot by the window, so there were no fluffy tails in the way of my webcam. I had a long talk with the branch manager, along with a few technicians, to just sort of dip my toe in the water. They were all courteous enough, but I could tell they'd been put through the ringer a couple of times. This wasn't their first assignment, and it wouldn't be their last. By the end of the day, I was talking with one of the salesmen, a woman named Deirdre. At that point, I'd been in constant Zoom calls for over 4 hours, and my voice was giving out. Deirdre could tell I was exhausted, and we just ended up talking about other things instead. My apartment, my job, my cat. I had to bother Marmalade a bit just to show her off. Deirdre showed off her feline companion, a 3-year-old ragdoll named Popeye. Ironically, that call ended up being my longest, but it went by the fastest. Deirdre was a gem. I spent most of my time setting up questionnaires and mapping out the overall structure, bouncing emails all the way down the supply chain, trying to get a clear picture of the main issues. It was the same old story that I'd heard 100 times before. Management blaming the salesman blaming the warehouse, and the warehouse blaming the technicians. There were little hitches all the way down the road, ranging from dated inventory systems to useless red tape. After the first few days, I started getting into a routine, ping-ponging between meetings and Excel spreadsheets. Marmalade and I made that apartment into a proper home. Chinese takeout boxes started lining the kitchenette, and I had a few extra talks with Deirdre just to pass the slow hours. I started getting used to that place, even the awful wallpaper. I stopped hearing the rumbling pipes after a while, and the cigarette smoke from the neighbour slowly blended into the background smells. I stopped waking from cars passing on the street below, and my first paycheck went into making the living room look like something that could actually be lived in. I remember one night when I was working overtime. I got a late email about submitting a progress report, so I had to stay up making a presentation. I found myself by the opinion that this was looking more and more like a management issue. Who the hell sends this kind of email at 4:50 p.m. on a Thursday, expecting it to be done before lunch the next day? Unbelievable. I was done by about 10 p.m. when I shambled away from my laptop. I picked up a can of cat food from Marmalade and walked over to a favourite window. Only she wasn't there. Her bed was still there, but Marmalade had moved to another window, still sleeping soundly, but she found a new favourite spot. It felt strange in a way, like the entire apartment had shifted a little. Looking up at the wallpaper, I could have sworn the patterns had moved. It looked identical, just a bit off. I could have sworn it was different, despite looking exactly the same. It was a strange feeling. Everything felt familiar, but that one little twist made it feel like a new room. I was starting to doubt myself. When looking at Marmalade out of a basket, however, it was clear that something was different in some way. The next few days, I started to notice this shift in new ways. The walls would look different at night. Where at one point I'd see a sunflower, I'd see a rose the next day. Then again, I wasn't ever really sure, and I chalked it up to me just not paying attention. Marmalade would move from spot to spot, never really sure what her favourite ever was. One night, she couldn't settle in at all, instead moving from one window to the next, meowing at me anxiously. That night, as I lay awake, I had my eyes firmly fixed on the wall. I could imagine the patterns moving on their own, the many flowers gently swaying to an invisible wind. It was just that kind of unreal surrealist thought you catch just before you fall asleep. But in that moment, I could have sworn it was real, living even. As I closed my eyes, I imagined the dark grey background colour to be as deep as an ocean, a darkness stretching into a distant nothing. The next day, as I was making my morning coffee, I noticed something peculiar. I stepped on a dry blue petal. I couldn't explain where it came from. I had no flowers in my apartment, and the ventilation was so bad that it could barely rotate air. Flower petals were out of the question. Marmalade played with it for a while, and I convinced myself that it was just something I dragged in. Still, it reminded me of a flower petal from the blue rose on the wallpaper. It made me anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. What was I even worried about? I couldn't let that thought go for the rest of the day. that I was missing something obvious, or maybe that there really was something to my strange paranoia. So, at the end of the day, when I talked to Deirdre, I brought it up. I explained that there was just something inherently creepy about living there, like an uncomfortable thought tickling your neck when you're not looking. Deirdre tried to reassure me, a chuckle coming through my headphones. "It takes time, love," she said. "You just got here. Besides, everything looks strange in the dark." "Yeah, I just can't shake the feeling, you know," I explained. "Like there's something more to it." "Like what?" I didn't know what to answer. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed Marmalade rolling on the living room carpet, casually playing with another blue petal. Turning on the lights, I could see more of them. Over a dozen dry blue petals lining the edge of the wall. Finally, I could tell I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't a one-time deal. That was real. Marmalade didn't seem to mind though. "I'm going to have to get back to you," I told Deirdre. "Something came up." As the call ended, I started scooping up the petals by hand. The moment my knees hit the floor, there was a power surge. It was all so quick, a flash of black. Marmalade hissed, looking straight past me. I could hear a rustling noise, like a large animal moving through a brush. As quick as it had come, it went, leaving only a startled cat and my elevated pulse behind. The lights were slapped back on with a click, blinding me. Marmalade retreated to behind the couch while I picked up the rest of the petals. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the many patterns, petals in hand. I could imagine the grey sinking deeper and deeper, showing me something past the obvious, like one of those images you have to look at cross-eyed to see the truth. I had the same sensation, like I was missing something obvious. I could imagine hearing things deep in an imagined forest. I could hear branches snapping. I could imagine the blue flowers swaying in the wind. And somewhere in that depthless dark, something roamed. Something looking for an exit. At some point, I snapped to attention. There was a loud electronic noise, an alarm. It was already morning. For some alien reason, I'd been stuck there for hours, just staring at the hypnotizing patterns. An entire night's rest gone. It wasn't until I stepped away that I realized just how exhausted I really was. My legs had locked in place, keeling me over straight to the stone-tiled living room floor. Marmalade rushed over, worried about this sudden development. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, calming myself down. The ringing from my cell phone was going strong, trying to give me enough time to shower before my first morning meetings. And yet, I just sat there, slowly petting my cat, my eyes bobbing in and out of sleep, my body deprived. Where had I been all night? What had I seen? I barely made it through that day, having a 45-minute nap over lunch. By the time I finished my last interview, I was a shell of my old self, barely conscious. I filled Marmalade's food and water bowl and crawled into bed with all my clothes still on. The moment my eyes closed, I could hear something in the distance. In the half-world between sleeping and waking, I heard breaking branches, owls taking flight, and something large approaching. And, despite knowing I was well and truly alone, my body screamed at me to wake, to have one more look, just in case. I did. I forced my eyes open. Something sharp scratched against the stone-tiled floor, something retreating in haste. A trail of dry petals leading right up to the side of my bed. After a night of dreamless sleep, I woke up to choking on something. It took me almost a full minute to cough up a blue petal, several of which had been sprinkled throughout my bed. I could have sworn the wallpaper looked a bit lighter, as if several flowers were looking sparse. The whole wall looked a bit darker. That morning, I'd had enough. I called in sick and brought out my toolbox. I started scraping off the wallpaper, piece by piece, across the entire apartment. I made a day of it, listening to music as Marmalade looked at me curiously. Every illustrated petal and stem dropped to the floor, cut by cut, like trimming a paper garden. By the end of the day, my wall was laid bare, revealing nothing but black, lead-painted concrete underneath. That night, after a long shower, I went to sleep with wallpaper remains still lining the edge of the room. Finally, I could focus. I could look past the hypnotizing patterns. It was done, gone, over. Except it wasn't. As I went to sleep, my eyes drifted to the barren walls, a black, eternal night, now unhindered by what little paper-thin barrier had been erected. Just looking at it gave me that feeling in my stomach, like I was falling forward. Even closing my eyes felt brighter than staring into it, like it was more than a colour, a place. At some point in the night, I heard this loud yell. Looking up, I could see Marmalade sitting at the edge of my bed, staring straight at the wall, hissing and raising her hackles. Looking straight ahead, I saw something. There, deep in the dark of the bare wall, something moved. I swooped up Marmalade, who clung to my shoulder like a parrot. I threw on my pants, shirt, and got my bag. I'd had enough. I wasn't about to stick around to find out the depths of what was either my own sanity or something unnatural entirely. I didn't want to know. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single wall had turned a midnight black. The windows had fogged up from the inside, blocking the moonlight from peeking in. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for the door. Something cold bumped against the palm of my hand. A finger. I recoiled, almost dropping Marmalade in surprise. I couldn't see my door. As I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I slowly came to the realization that nothing was quite as it should. The kitchenette was further away, the windows were further apart, the proportions of the room were off, and seemingly shifting every time I blinked. It was as if everything in that darkness was untrue, malleable, subtly shifting as soon as I looked away. And so was I. Looking down at my hands, they seemed different with every blink of my eye. They could be older, younger, scarred, masculine. It was impossible to tell. It was just diffuse enough for an anxious mind to fill in the blanks, but it felt like more than that. It wasn't just the fear of the dark. It was the dark changing me. Finally, I fumbled my way to the front door. I pulled it open. And there was nothing. Just a solid black nothing. The apartment was getting darker. Even the windows were turning black. The kitchen sink was running, pushing forth dark, nondescript globs. all of which had this peculiar chemical smell, like ammonia. Marmalade was freaking out. She clung to me, digging her claws into my shirt, hissing at something in the dark. Whenever I turned around, the room would look different, swallowed further and further by the night. I could see vague silhouettes, hands reaching forward, some small, some impossibly large. I can imagine creatures the size of skyscrapers towering forward, impish little beasts nipping at my heels. I curled into a ball on the floor, clutching Marmalade close to my chest. Together, we stared down anything and everything creeping closer. But I was losing. My light was dying. It was all going dark. Then, I felt a rumble. I'd forgotten my phone was still in my pants. Bringing it out, I had a new message from Deirdre. The little screen lighting up a little bubble around me. I wasn't even on the floor anymore. I was sitting on a pile of dry grass and blue petals, and I could see the edge of a dead field stretching out around me in all directions. A wind cut through me like cold glass. And there really were things moving out there. Some big, some small, all vague and horrifying, waiting for me to look away long enough to take shape. "Hey hon, I heard you were feeling under the weather, so I just wanted to check in. Get plenty of rest. We'll talk soon." It played again and again. I filled my head with her voice, and my eyes with that little light the phone struggled to provide. I could feel Marmalade's pulse beating against my neck. Something would brush against me, a light kick against my foot, footsteps rushing past. I saw nothing, but they were there, hidden in the dark. "We'll talk soon," Deirdre's message repeated for the 10th time. I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting for the dark to pass, but nothing came of it. The battery was dying. As it reached the final few percentages of power, there was little left for me to do. The light was shrinking. I couldn't hear Deirdre's message anymore. Marmalade was yowling like crazy, hissing and striking at something unseen. As the screen died, I felt the chill of the world descend on me. In the silence, I could feel something approaching, something careful and calculated. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, smiling at me, leering, eager. I was panicking. My skin felt like ice, and I couldn't feel my fingers. I held Marmalade close to me, and in a last-ditch effort, I flung my phone into the dark. Glass shattered. I'd thrown it through the window next to the little French balcony. A beam of morning light broke through. I turned around to an empty apartment. The layout exactly as I'd remembered it. The kitchenette still running, torn down wallpaper lining the edges of the room, Marmalade's favourite bed still by the window, and the many Chinese takeout boxes still left unattended, just as it should be. Except every inch of the room was covered in dry, blue flower petals. Needless to say, I didn't stick around for long. I moved out to the branch office where Deirdre worked and ended up staying there. We're still best friends to this day. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about what happened that night. I get the sense that whatever lived in that dark space was just waiting for someone to tear down that barrier, that hedge of flowers and patterns, something waiting to pull me into a dark place, never to return. Poor Marmalade hasn't been the same since. Her fur has turned a matted orange, and she's a lot clingier than before. She's okay though. She's a happy cat. But it'd be a lie to say she hasn't changed. The same can be said about me. It isn't a single obvious thing, but I feel like there are things about me that aren't the same. My eyes look darker, my fingers longer, my teeth sharper and whiter. Just enough for me to notice and remember. In my new place, I sleep with the lights on. I try not to look too closely at the wallpaper, just in case. When Jake told me he had something to show me, I was curious, but also a little worried. He'd been my best friend since junior high, and I loved and trusted him like a brother. But I also couldn't forget that 3 months earlier, he'd been in an institution instead of living across town. The story of that had ended up with him being diagnosed with schizophreniform disorder and sent for inpatient treatment, but it started by Jake freaking out in a college algebra class. I wasn't there, but supposedly he was screaming in some language no one understood and attacked his professor. And in the days that followed, he told the doctors that he'd been dreaming for weeks about living in another part of the world, though he wasn't sure where. According to his parents, he didn't remember screaming and biting his math professor at all. With therapy and meds, he got better over time, and if you asked him if any of that stuff had been real, other than the biting of course, he'd look embarrassed and shake his head, tell you that it had all been crossed wires in his head, and that he was better now. And I think most people believed him. But I knew Jake well, maybe better than anyone, and I could see it in his eyes when he looked my way. He was lying, or at least holding something back. We started hanging out again fairly regularly as life allowed, but I still felt tense around him. Not because I thought he was dangerous, but because I wanted him to be okay, and I felt responsible for watching him closely for any sign that he still needed help. But when he showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later, I could see he was excited, and it actually made me relax a little. The meds made him calmer and flatter in some ways, and while that was probably a good thing, it also made him seem different. This was more like the old Jake, full of energy and ready to tell you or show you something funny or awesome. He'd referenced the video on the phone, and when he came in, I saw he had his laptop under one arm. I raised an eyebrow at him. What, we couldn't look it up on YouTube or something? He grinned as he set the laptop on the kitchen counter and opened it up. Nope, not this. It's special. On his screen was a website showing what looked like video from a camera perched high up on a pole or building and pointed out over a multi-lane freeway and part of some city on the far side. There, the sun was bright, and you could see steady streams of cars going in both directions, and in the upper left part of the camera's view, you could see a long pedestrian bridge with people passing to and fro, oblivious to our scrutiny. I glanced at him. Is this live or a video? Jake grinned. It's live. It's Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I glanced back at the video. That made sense. It was after 10 at night where we were, but it was probably the next morning there. But still. I mean, that's neat and all, but I've seen city cameras before. Lots of places live stream now. Is there some... Shut up, here she comes. I followed where his finger was emphatically jabbing at the screen. Coming towards the camera along the footbridge was a squat woman with black and grey hair that looked to be in her late 50s. The image, while good quality, wasn't clear enough to show her face in any real detail, but her movements were stiff and strange, as though she were aching with every step, or maybe had sleptwalked the entire way there. I looked back over at Jake. "Who is that?" He gave a small laugh. "I don't know her name. It doesn't matter, but I know her. She's the one I've been dreaming about for months." My stomach began to curl in on itself. "Jake, have you taken your meds today?" He didn't look at me, but I saw his jaw clench and jump before he spoke. "I did, but it doesn't make a difference. I'm not crazy. I never was. Just shut up and listen to me." He tapped the screen where the woman had come to a stop on the middle of the bridge. "This woman, I knew she was going to come to the bridge because I made her do it. I spent half the afternoon picturing it until I knew it had set in." My mind was racing with what I should do next. Do I call someone? Try to get him to go to the doctor? What if he got weirder or even violent? Maybe I should just hear him out and then go from there. I don't really understand what you're talking about." Still looking at the screen, he let out a long breath. "Yeah, I know it sounds crazy. That's why I want to show you. Give me just a second. I have to concentrate." Jake let his arms hang down by his sides as he stared intently at the video feed. After over a minute of awkward silence, he started to raise his right hand, first to his head, then above it, stretched up and straight, like he wanted to answer a question in class. I was about to ask what he was doing when I saw it. The woman on the bridge was raising her hand too. Heart pounding, I looked between the video and Jake. He was raising his other arm in the same way, and about 3 or 4 seconds behind, the woman was doing the same thing. He turned to beam at me, and to my horror, I saw the woman turning to smile in our direction as well. What the hell is this? Some kind of internet trick?" He snorted. "No trick. I'll show you. Ask me to do something simple. I don't have good control yet." I started shaking my head. "Look, I don't know what this is, but it's freaking me out." Jake scowled at me. "Don't be a wuss. Tell me to do something. Simon says." Taking a step back, I rolled my eyes in irritation to hide my growing fear. "Fine, jump up and down." Giggling, he nodded and began jumping up and down while keeping both arms up. After a brief delay, the woman started doing the same thing, and when he stopped a few moments later, so did she. "Okay, so how are you doing it?" "No, I can tell you still think it's fake. Pick something else, something harder." "Look, I really don't want to." His face darkened into a scowl. "Just do it, okay?" Gritting my teeth, I nodded. "Fine, slap yourself in the face. Hard." I thought this would call his bluff. Either the video woman wouldn't have done that, or if this was some elaborate hoax where he paid some stranger to mimic him through a hidden camera he brought with him or something, she'd hesitate to hurt herself. One way or another, it might stop whatever weird nonsense he was trying to pull. But no. He just smiled wider as he took a step back and placed a hand on the counter for support. "Now that's more like it." The first slap across his face sounded loud as a gunshot in the small kitchen, and he let out a gasp of pain as the right side of his face immediately started to redden. I was so focused on him that it took me a moment to realize I was seeing her mimic him in my peripheral vision. Same spot, just as hard. Jeez, what? He hit himself a second time, even harder. She did the same, and this time, they were both bleeding from the nose when they straightened back up. Stop, just stop! He gave a soft laugh and then struck himself a third time, hard enough that he seemed unsteady on his feet. When I looked at the woman, she was holding onto the bridge railing like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I turned back to Jake and grabbed his arm. Stop that right now! You're hurting yourself, and her! When he grinned at me this time, I could see a film of blood on his teeth. So, you believe me now? Shuddering, I gave a nod. I guess so. I mean, yes, I do. Stop hitting her, and how? And then he told me. I started having strange dreams a year ago. It was like falling asleep as myself and waking up as another person. I've had dreams like that before, but not this long and detailed and real. I could move around for several hours sometimes, and I remembered all of it. I'd go out into the city. I figured out it was Kuala Lumpur, and when I was there, I could read and understand the language, even though I don't know any of that stuff when I'm awake. But the weirdest thing was, I was always the same person when I was over there. This woman on the bridge. It was like we were swapping. Now, I'm not crazy, and for a time I just assumed it was some kind of lucid dreaming or something. I was dreaming versions of the same dream and just fooling myself into thinking it was real. This went on for months. And then one day, I dozed off in algebra class. I really don't remember what happened because I wasn't there. I don't know if this woman is normally asleep in my mind when I'm awake in hers, but this time, she sure the hell knew something was going on and freaked out. Thanks to her, I wound up in the loony bin, and now I have everyone looking at me like I'm Jeffrey Dahmer. Even you. Nah, don't deny it. It's okay. I don't blame you. But I hate it too. So I decided I needed to figure out what this was and try to either get rid of it or control it. I started trying different things in the hospital, reading books on meditation and self-hypnosis, even astral projection. Most of it is hippie nonsense, but I got a few ideas that helped me to focus. I started feeling like I could feel her a little, even when I was awake, and over time, I started thinking I could maybe make her do something if I could concentrate on it hard enough. The first few tries, well, it's hard to say. It's not just in your imagination, right? I mean, how the hell am I going to know if some lady in Malaysia picks up a pencil because I wanted her to? But one night, when I was inside her in my dream, I went walking through the city. It was early afternoon there, and I remember walking for miles until I got to this freeway and this bridge. And it was then that I saw the camera up above. I asked the teenager that was passing what kind of camera that was, and that's when he said the magic words. It's a streaming webcam. He gestured at the woman on the bridge again as she started to wander off. I've been practicing this for weeks now. This is only the third time I've gotten her to the bridge, but once she's there, I can see that it works, and when I'm done, I just kinda let go, and she wanders on back home. I just stared at him. Jeez, man, that's a person. Even if this works like you're saying, that's messed up to just take someone over and hurt them and stuff. Jake grimaced at me. First off, save your moral judgments. You're the one that said slap in the face, not me. I've never heard it before. Oh, really? What the hell do you think she thinks when she wakes up halfway across the city and doesn't know how she got there? He looked uncomfortable at that, but gave a shrug. I don't know. And yeah, I have thought about that. But I don't know her, and I don't know that she's not responsible for this in the first place, whatever it is. What I do know is that I'm not having people think I'm a nutter-butter for the rest of my life. And if I don't know how to turn it off, I'm going to figure out how to prove to people that it's real. I let out a sigh. Damn, I get that. Not that I think you're crazy. Not really. I just thought you had like a breakdown or something, you know. But this... I don't know that it's even safe to tell people about it. He frowned at that. What do you mean? Well, even if you get people to believe you, does that really help you? How do you know somebody won't just snatch you up to experiment on you or something? Jake's eyes widened. I hadn't really thought of that. I nodded. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a movie, but what part of this doesn't sound like some horror movie sci-fi nonsense? I reached out and gripped his shoulder. Maybe just leave it alone. I know you want to vindicate yourself or whatever, but I know it now, and in time, other people will forget and treat you normal. When he started to shake his head, I gripped his shoulder harder. And if they don't, screw 'em. But you don't know what this is you're messing with, and you're messing with a stranger who either doesn't deserve it or is maybe causing it. Just close the door and see if it goes away over time. Tears in his eyes, he began to nod as he leaned forward and gave me a quick hug. Thanks, man. You're probably right. When we parted, I kept a smile on my face, despite the dark thoughts churning in my head. That the Jake I knew would never hurt someone else, even to prove the point he was trying to make. And that, when I looked over his shoulder at the webcam feed the last time, the woman had stopped wandering away. She was standing further down the bridge, looking at the camera. Staring right at me. 2 more weeks went by, and while I didn't see Jake, we texted most days, and he seemed to be doing better. Said the dreams were still there, but he could usually get out of them after just an hour or 2. We made plans to go hiking next weekend. But then, 2 nights ago, he was banging on my door in the middle of the night. When I opened up, he came rushing in, covered in sweat and clearly terrified. Someone's after me, man. I shut and locked the door behind him before turning to follow him into the living room. What are you talking about? Who's following you? He shrugged. I don't know for sure. I haven't seen them good enough, but it's the same red car for the last 2 days with heavy tint on the windows. Well, why don't you call the cops? Jake shook his head. They'd find out I just got locked up and think I'm being paranoid. You're the only one who knows I'm not crazy. I nodded. Okay, well, did they follow you here? I think so. I tried to lose them, but I don't know if I did. Moving past him, I went to the sliding doors leading out to the balcony. Opening them, I stepped out and looked down into the orange-lit parking lot below. My heart sank as I saw a red car parked next to my own, its windows too dark to see inside. Damn. Oh damn, are they... Damn! I looked over at him, even as his face grew tight with fear. Oh God, it's her. She's here. He was right. I'd been focused on the car at first, but directly underneath us was a short, older woman with black and grey hair that, well, I'd never seen her clearly, but I'd seen enough to know this looked like her. What was she doing all the way over? She found me. I need to go. I don't know what she can do, what she's capable of. It's not safe to... His legs kicking and his chest shuddering. I leaned over to help, but quickly realised I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call 911, but then I realised how stupid I was being. This was all her fault, wasn't it? It wasn't a coincidence that she came all this way and then he started having a seizure or whatever this was. Anger burning in my chest, I stood up, ready to shout down at her for her to stop it, to get lost and to leave him alone. But the words died in my throat as I saw her down there, staring up at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked tight with tension as she murmured out just a handful of words. "No, please, don't. I'm sorry." Then I saw the flash of a box cutter as she raised it to her throat and slashed it wet and wide. Even as she was falling over, I saw Jake sitting up and turning to look at me. His face split into a smile. "Thanks for having me over. I think I'm okay now." I reached out to help him up, but when he met my eyes, I recoiled. Sure, we need to call the police. She's dead." He nodded as he rose to his feet. "Yeah, sure, we can call the authorities. They should be made aware." Another glance my way. "Are you okay too?" I nodded and moved quickly off the balcony to get my phone. Grabbing it up, I stepped out of the apartment to make the call and waited in the breezeway until they arrived. Jake came out when the ambulance and police pulled up, and after we both told them several times that a strange woman we didn't know had hurt herself outside, they eventually left again with her body. "I guess I should be getting home too." He smiled at me. "Thanks again for your help." He sounded like I helped him with his car or something. "See you again soon." I forced myself to meet her eyes for a moment. No, I don't think you will. I think it's better for both of us if you don't." The smile widened then. "No, perhaps not. Still, my thanks. Have a good night." I shut the door then and bolted it, and even after I watched Jake's car drive away, I couldn't go to sleep. I didn't go outside again until today, but then I didn't have a choice. I was the only one there. A shabby funeral for an unknown foreigner that had inexplicably flown halfway around the world to die in front of a couple of strangers. Even the government-paid chaplain that did the eulogy could only speak in vague platitudes about the mysterious life and things unseen. He came over after to offer his condolences, and after an awkward pause, he asked me how I knew the departed. Tears in my eyes, I looked up and told him. He was my best friend. It began with a black bag over my head. 6 or 7 men seizing me off the street on my way home from work, holding me at gunpoint in the back of a van. They explained in detail what would happen to my family if I didn't listen to them. Until that moment, torture was just a word. I'd never given it much thought. I wasn't prepared to hear some of the things they told me. By the time they were loading me onto a helicopter, I would have done anything they asked. I arrived at the black site, kicked out of the chopper, where my feet hit the hard-packed wet mud with a splash. Black hood torn off so hard it hurt the skin on the tip of my nose. And then I got my first look at the place. Can't say if it met my expectations or not. I didn't have any idea where I was going or what it was supposed to look like when I got there. Still, it managed to leave me feeling surprised. An abandoned village nestled in the jungle. Mostly one-room hovels, lots of corrugated iron. Here and there lay burned allotments, dying pepper plants left untended, their fruits stamped into the earth by the passage of soldiers dressed in all black. Rotten fences and troughs to feed long-dead pigs and goats lay smashed to pieces. And then, lurking on a hill like some architectural jump scare, was a 3-story hospital made of glass and steel. State-of-the-art, built in a place where tarmac was just a rumour. Officially, it had been put there by a charitable non-profit wanting to research novel diseases and potential cures deep in the jungle. Unofficially, it had always belonged to the CIA, a useful place to test strange things with pox in the name. And when the time came, a useful place to dissect the impossible. Imagine my surprise when I was escorted by armed men to an office with my name on the door and discovered that I was to be in charge of its latest major project. Head of Research printed on the glass. Real official looking. Big black letters like I'd always worked there. First thing I thought, how long do they intend to keep me here? But that didn't last long. The hospital became my home and has been ever since. Less than 24 hours after my arrival, and I had my feet up on the desk barking orders at lab technicians. I slipped into the role easier than I'd like to admit. You see, where they got me was on scientific curiosity. That's how they ensured I was on board with the project. That's why they never pointed a gun at me after day one. They didn't have to. The second I saw that thing inside the Messiah's chest cavity, I was a willing asset. No more me, only the project, the discovery and the revelations. Lying on that slab, nestled in the flesh of an otherwise normal-looking man, was a white-hot piece of divinity, a pinprick in the fabric of reality. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like I'd spent my whole life seeing 2-dimensional shadows, and then I suddenly got a glimpse of the 3-dimensional shapes casting them. I haven't seen my children since they took me. Couldn't tell you their names. I was never the same after the first autopsy. No one in that place was sane after the scalpel first bit into his flesh. Attrition amongst the research staff was incredibly high. Every day, another nurse seized by stigmata, or a once faithless lab technician struck by the call to write the Third Testament. The guards dealt with the unwilling members of the team. Traumatized scientists and clinicians lined up one by one against an exposed brick wall in the jungle heat and shot. I remember smoking in the cafeteria in between surgeries, nervously shaking as I tried to ignore the pop, pop, pop of some of my more stubborn colleagues being executed. And then back to work, where I suppressed the feeling that I was the worst kind of traitor. Next day, there'd be new faces scrubbing up and asking for orders, another pair of hands shipped in from God knows where. Back to cataloguing divinity. At times, I imagined joining the objectors, the people who found religion in a sterile Black Ops lab. But that thing we pulled out of him, that baffling enigma that burned my eyes, it consumed the project. Everything we learned about it felt like a quantum leap in our understanding of microbiology. We tested everything we could get our hands on. Plants, animals, humans, I tried not to look any of them in the eye. Quiet people taken from some quiet part of the earth where they wouldn't be missed. All of them scared. Did they know? I mean, really know the suffering they were in for? Definitely not. They expected to be shot, I imagine, not to wake up with the roof of their mouth lined with eyeballs. I'm ashamed to say, but those kinds of results invigorated me, excited me even. When it all fell apart and I missed the evacuation, I got to finally rifle through all those classified documents where I discovered I hadn't been selected because I was some genius of microbiology, but rather because my psychological profile made it clear I'd do anything if you dangled a big enough mystery in front of me. That, and the fact that I was actually quite good at managing projects. Geniuses usually aren't great at sending out memos or keeping track of performance numbers. Thankfully, I'm no genius. It was humbling at times, working with some of the guys down below, being senior to them even. I mean, Dr. Coates was probably the smartest man I'd ever met. No real academic career, because he had a habit of hyperfixating on things that either couldn't be solved or which no one gave a damn about. But it was pretty clear this was a guy who could have turned his brain to just about anything and made a name for himself if he was just a little more on the ball. He was an odd un, basically. Gave lectures barefoot, would respond to last-minute marking deadlines by giving every student a B, threw a stapler at the head of his department, that kind of thing. Intelligent, but not particularly sensible. The project broke him, broke his worldview, broke his mind, and, towards the end, even his body. You might think the problem was asking a hyper-rational man to process the divine, but if anything, he processed it a little too well. He was the first person to read the Third Testament without going insane. Immediately insane, I should say. Or maybe he was always nuts to begin with. Either way, he managed to take all the random scribbles and bits of verse that we'd collected from the personal effects of the deceased and actually put it together into a single document. Then he read it and came out looking like nothing special had happened. The next guy after him, not so lucky. But Dr. Coates, he carried on working for a few days after, took measurements of this, made records of that, slipped into the background, out of my notice, while I focused on trying to figure out some way of getting the Third Testament scanned into a computer without it causing havoc. A lot like the people who read it, machines like to give out halfway through reading the Third Testament. Not Coates, though. He seemed just fine. I should have known better. The first clue that something wasn't quite right was when I went to his office. A cramped space with metal walls and floors, no windows given it was below ground, and a countertop full of equipment. It was always a mess in there, and usually a bit smelly too. But it was usually just that unwashed scientist smell. But one day, when I went to call on him, he opened the door and I got the whiff of something that was just wrong. Smelled a little like death, only not quite. Just different. Moldy almost. Of course, he was entitled to do some experimentations on his own time, and that's what I figured it was. At the time, I wrote it off. Had other things on my mind. Only the smell got worse with time. Turned up day after day, and each time it stung my nose a little more, hung around my sinuses a little longer. And Coates, He looked a little worse for wear each time too. Again, nothing serious. The kind of thing that's actually quite normal for a man like him. I'm used to seeing scientists fixate on a problem, something quiet they won't share with anyone else until they know for sure what they've got. That's what he was like, and I figured when he was ready, he'd either show me something that would blow my socks off, or it'd be something stupid, like he got his microwave to evenly heat up his lunch by taking it apart and rewiring its insides. Sometimes I wonder if I'd caught it earlier. Could I have done something about it? Someone smarter might have picked up the odd chemical mixtures on his shelf, or recognized the peculiar smells. Not me, though. All I can say in hindsight is thank God my office was above ground. By the time his little project had finished working its way through the floor he was on, he'd killed 36 people with his homemade nerve gas. Thankfully, the facility was prepared for that kind of attack, and the automated security systems had the entire level locked down very quickly so the damage wasn't that bad. Could have been a lot worse. But what was weird was the venting system wasn't working. Should have cleared it out in under a day. But 4 hours later, and the gas levels were the same. The investigation, at least at first, had to happen remotely. CCTV from his lab was spotty. Something was corroding the cameras. But based on some of his material requests, we guessed he'd been culturing some unusual fungus to create the bioweapon. Whatever it was potent, and we were helpless to do anything about it. We had to wait and hope to God whatever awful thing he'd concocted would wear out on its own. What little the CCTV could capture made for a grueling sight. 8 scientists dead at their desks, slumped over, blood pouring out of their mouths. The fluid looked black on the grainy black and white monitor. But what upset me more were the assistants. Dozens of young men and women who didn't really belong in that place. Too much to live for, and all of them so scared of what was going to happen to them. And they were just lying there, in the middle of whatever it was they were doing. In the labs themselves, smashed beakers and machines in disarray. In their rooms, some of them lay peacefully sleeping. Others held each other in secret little trysts they thought no one knew about. All over the level, bodies lay on the floor in strange positions. And again, that black fluid leaking from every orifice, staining the floor, their faces and their clothes, soaking their chests and groins. I remember sitting there and just watching them twitch and foam at the mouths, waiting for death to finally come. Even then, the hours ticked on as we waited for the systems to purge the gas. 12, 24, 48. Nothing happened. It was like everything in there was frozen in time. And then, somehow, the lights in that level went out. Emergency lighting came on, bathing everything in red. But combined with the low-quality cameras, it was like gazing at an old video game. Grainy, fuzzy, low resolution. We figured that Coates must have rigged up a remote timer on the electronics, which wasn't a good guess, since his speciality was biochemistry and the security systems were of the highest tier. But what else could it be? Wasn't like someone could have hit the circuit breaker. We knew eventually we'd have to go in there. 60 hours after shutdown, we just had to. There was too much high-value material to leave behind, and there were reports of strange noises down there. Guards posted to the door heard faint sounds on the other side. Footsteps, they reckoned. Of course, I wrote that off. Utter nonsense, I told myself and them. And yet, we still went in armed because, well, if Coates was smart enough to rig this whole nightmare, who's to say he didn't make a little gas mask to keep himself safe? You'd think I'd be used to working in hazmat suits, and I sort of am. But going into that sealed-off floor was something else. The visor felt restrictive, the squeak of the rubber suit was deafening, my breath was too loud, and every time the in-suit radio came to life with one of the soldiers' barks, I damn near jumped out of my skin. And then the door actually opened. Nothing could have prepared me for that. The air was thick with mist, which lit up harshly with the emergency lighting's red hue. Old metal grates, vents, open doorways, all of it either blood red or completely dark. There were far too many shadows for it to feel safe. It didn't help some of the bulbs were strobe lighting, rotating sirens that lit the place up in periodic flashes of crimson light. God, even the 4 soldiers next to me looked nervous. We passed more than a few bodies on our way to Coates' lab. All of them lay where they'd been on the CCTV, at least as far as I could tell. Sounds stupid, but I stared at a few of them closely just to make sure. All those reports of footsteps had started to worm their way into my brain. Couldn't shake the idea we weren't alone down there. When we finally opened the door to Coates, what I saw left me frozen to the spot. The soldiers focused on the strange growth off to the corner of the room, which registered to me only as a dim sort of collection of thick fungal petals crawling up the wall, veins pulsing like capillaries in the eye. But to me, what really hit home was the empty desk. Last time they had reliable footage of that room, Coates had been lying there, dead as a dodo, blood leaking from his still open eyes, pooling on the desk and dripping onto the floor. And that stain was still very much there. There was even the faint outline of where his head had been laying. But the man himself was gone. This, even more than the grotesque thing that took up one wall, terrified me. That quivering mass of fungus was pumping out enough toxic gas to kill half the base, but it was stationary at least. In another circumstance, I might have even found it fascinating. But Coates, he'd clearly gone off the deep end. Had he lain perfectly still for days on end to trick us? That didn't seem right. Again, I thought the bodies we'd passed, the way they looked so still, but not lifeless, like a porcelain doll, there was that slight suggestion of something working behind the eyes. "What do we do with this?" one of the men asked. "Take samples, burn the rest," I replied. "If gas levels don't go down in a week, we'll have to purge the whole floor with phosphorus." The whole time, I had my eyes on the space around us, under the desk, on top of the cupboards. If Coates wasn't at his desk, where was he? "Where the hell did this thing come from?" the same soldier muttered as he laid a series of thermal charges on the fleshiest parts of the mold. It seemed to flinch in response to his touch, but otherwise benign. He probably took some of the subject's tissue samples. We know it propagates unusual levels of growth in plants and animal tissue. Explains why the gas levels don't go down. What's it metabolizing? I gave the soldier an odd look. "What?" he said. "You aren't the only ones with an education." "Fair enough," I replied, with a quick shake of the head. "It isn't metabolizing anything except his tissue. It's, well, bluntly, I think of the fish and the bread, right? It's something we've known about his tissue samples for a while now. Spontaneous creation of matter and energy out of nothing. But, to give Coates his credit, this is a pretty novel application. he's created an infinite bioweapon. Why? I was about to reply, I haven't the slightest clue, when a loud bang drew our attention to the doorway. Outside lay a darkness, broken only by the strobing of a red light. Flashing on and off, it revealed, for just a single instant, the outline of a man standing in the hallway. The soldiers swore nervously as they raised the rifles. By the time the light came back, the figure was gone. "Who the hell was that?" one barked. "Must be Coates," another replied. "Job's done," I cried while gesturing to the charges. "Let's get the hell out of..." "There are no miracles left for you. You have made your own miracles." The words were growled so loud and deep they seemed to vibrate my very bones. The soldiers snapped to attention. But me? I took a little longer to turn back to the corner of the room. I knew what I was going to see. But God, I didn't want to see it. There are other gardens, but not for you. Do not spoil the other Edens. Coates emerged from the thing in the wall, pulling himself free with a wet squelch. He stood, not naked, but clearly naked, as his skin began to absorb his clothes. He looked like a burn victim coated in algae. He loves you. In spite of everything, he loves you. And there is a place in heaven for you all. But it is time to... I can't blame the soldier who pulled the trigger. It wasn't just the fact that Coates was speaking with a mouth that had grown grotesquely across his abdomen, but rather that the words were drilling straight into our heads, like some pushing up. It made my eyes cross, my ears ache, and my nose bleed. Two of the men had vomited, splattering the inside of their visors with thick fluid. They were the first to go. They didn't see what hit them, and I'm somewhat glad. Coates, angered by the gunshot, moved with the elegance of a dancer. I stumbled out into the corridor as he tore them apart, his arms seemingly flowing right through their biohazard suit. The remaining soldier, the trigger-happy one, was beside me as I fled. It wasn't far to the exit. I hoped we would make it the rest of the way without incident, that in just a few short hours I might be able to put the few images I had of Coates pulling flesh and fabric apart like it was tissue deep into some recess of my mind and just move on. But it was only a few short steps into the dark before the remaining soldier began to fire blindly at the corridor behind us. It was a mistake for him to turn around. In the fraction of a second where his eyes had been turned away, he missed one of the bodies lying on the ground. I jumped. He didn't. I was dimly aware of there being no one beside me, only when the gunshots grew fainter and fainter as I left him behind. One of the shots dinged off a panel by my head, and to this day, I suspect it was not a ricochet, but a deliberate attempt to get revenge for me abandoning him. Still, I didn't look back. Not until I reached the secure door. I thumbed the keypad frantically, terrified as my ears registered the sound of approaching footsteps muffled by the biohazard suit. God, I couldn't stop myself. I looked. I had nothing else to do except wait for the security to clear me and open the door, and there was no guarantee they'd even do that. I might be waiting forever, staring at nothing as Coates came closer and closer. Without even realizing what I was doing, I turned and saw the soldier with the gun. Jeez, Coates' office was out of sight, so I had no idea if he repeated this with the other two. But the man I saw, he was in pieces, yellow and red, in ragged strips that coated the ceiling as much as the floor, and barreling toward me on all fours, legs and arms too long for a normal man, came Coates, eyes wide, jaw distended, chunks out of his head still missing. But his mouth, it silently spoke the same few words, almost in time with his loping gallop, over and over and over. It would take days for me to even realize what it was he was saying. Thankfully, before he'd managed to reach me, the doors opened and a hail of gunfire filled the corridor ahead. Coates, fast as lightning, disappeared into some dark crevice, and I was dragged to safety before the worst might happen. As soon as I was on the other side, I told security to flood the place with phosphorus, and everything was purged. White-hot fire on demand. By the time it was over, only metal remained, and even then, a lot of it had melted and cooled in strange shapes on the floor. I also went out of my way to kill any attempts at reclaiming the lost workplace. Higher-ups were mad. All that square footage lost, but I said the risk of contamination was too great. Of course, I left out the part where I returned one quiet night a few days later and placed my ear against the thick steel wall that I knew ran close to one of the vents on that level. It was faint, but I heard Coates whispering. Only then did I get the final clue to what Coates had been saying as he came towards me in the flashing red of that darkened corridor. "We love you, we love you, we love you, we love you, we love you." Even now, the cameras show that level to be a sterile hollow space, but I cannot escape the feeling that if I were to open it, I would see Coates come slithering out of some long-forgotten vent, perhaps worse for wear, given all the time that has since passed, but Coates nonetheless, terrifying and misshapen, but desperate to spread the very testament that twisted his mind and body, that caused him to try and breed something that might well have ended the entire world. And the worst thing of all, what he'd been saying to me in that corridor. What if it was true? What if he hadn't done it out of hate, but love? At the time, I assumed the force we were dealing with was hostile. But what if it wasn't? Everyone who goes near the Third Testament kills themselves, and until Coates, I thought it some kind of twisted revenge. But what if that wasn't the case? What if he wasn't doing it out of spite or hostility? What would that mean for me? Forgiveness? If so, that terrified me, because after everything I'd been through, I doubted I'd have the strength to resist that kind of offer. For weeks I lay awake at night, wondering just what the hell might be in those words that could compel people like Coates to do what they did. And yet, despite everything, I still haven't read the Third Testament. Coates was a genius, and he still gave in. I know that I did some pretty messed up stuff in the name of scientific curiosity, but, well, I guess I'm not ashamed to say I'm also a coward. I'm afraid of dying. Curiosity can only get you so far, and after seeing everything that happened to the people who read that thing, I couldn't bring myself to risk it. Whatever the Third Testament is, hearing it seems pretty bad for your health. I don't think I even deserve to be forgiven, if that is what he's offering. It was poetic justice that out of all the people who managed to make the evacuation, I wasn't one of them. Leaving on foot is hardly an option for me. I mean, even if I had the strength to hike through hundreds of miles of rainforest, I need to reach the outer fence first. And strange things have festered in the chemical pits where they disposed of the bodies. Soft mounds of ash and bone that sing from time to time, exciting the birds in the canopy to take off and make strange patterns in the sky. If they can sing, they must have mouths, right? And if they have mouths, what else? I think about coats, about what kind of hands would reach out to drag me into those rotten pits of long dead flesh and drown me in filth. And I shudder. I could try and sneak past, but it really isn't safe outside the hospital. It isn't safe inside, to be fair. But what choice do I have? At least there's still power, internet, food to last me over a century, and security doors that keep everything below sub-level 1 firmly locked away. While out there, well, I see things sometimes, moving quickly between the old buildings. The trees shake and stir, and where jungle now grows thick and heavy against one of the glass walls of the hospital, the vines twist and turn and spell out odd messages. I shut my eyes firmly whenever I have to pass them. And yet, even blind, I can hear the tightening fibrous coils as the clawing flora scratches against the glass. They want me, hungering. All those corpses we buried out there, rotting, breaking down, contaminated with divinity. What strange waters flow through the soil in this place. Nothing could make me risk opening the doors and try walking through that vegetation. He might forgive, but I don't think my former test subjects have. And as for down below, you know, I never met him while he was alive. Don't know where they got him from, or even why. My bet, he ticked off the wrong people, got shot and got back up. Maybe they shot him again and he got up again. Maybe they did it 5 times, 10 times, I don't know. Somewhere along the lines, someone worked out they had an anomaly on their hands. Maybe I wasn't the first person to even try cutting him open. It's just weird. No one ever told us who he was. We just knew. It'd be years before I wondered who mothered him, loved him, raised him. I often wonder if this was the way it was meant to go, or was it just an accident that he bumped into the wrong people at the wrong time? The Messiah came, and the first thing we did was cut him up. No wonder we failed. Things in the project started to go really bad about 6 months after the first incision. High turnover amongst researchers was one thing, but, well, it turns out a lot of the soldiers had religious inclination. It wasn't just us dealing with visions and voices. At some point, they worked out what they were part of. The agency likes compartmentalization, but it can only go so far. After the religious element became clear to the guys on the ground, things started to break down. It was one thing to control the scientists, but the guards were armed. When they broke hard. Most of his remains are stored in the lowest level, where it's easiest to keep things cool. Outside, there's this long corridor leading to the central chamber. Huge, wide enough to drive 4 or 5 cars side by side. And that was where the first guard hanged himself. Simple enough. They dragged him away and cleaned it up. It wasn't long after Coates. In fact, it was one of the men who saved me at the door. But pretty soon, another 2 guys went down there and hanged themselves, and then 5, and then 8. And then, topside, some people started blowing their brains out. In their barracks, in the canteens, standing watch at the doors, looking out on the jungle, cigarette hanging loose on one lip. Seemed almost random, except there was a clear pattern of escalation. When those guys started killing their friends, that's when it reached the point where they couldn't ship new guys in fast enough to replace losses. Once that happened, orders started getting lost, jobs started being left undone. One lab got written off because a test subject's body was left to fester over a weekend, and by the time they got the door open, there was flesh growing up the walls. Not enough manpower to deal with it, so they left it for another day and moved on. Only, they forgot to tell the researcher who worked there. So, come Monday, he went in and had a hell of a surprise. Must have been like stepping into a wall of sourdough. I can only hope he suffocated and it was quick. But who knows? Not like that stuff has hard and fast rules. For all I know, he's still in there, screaming for air. Meanwhile, that tunnel. People just kept going down there and hanging themselves. I mean, every day I'd wake up and I'd be down a few researchers and a couple more guards would be missing. Took a shockingly short amount of time for most of the 600 people on site to just disappear. God knows when security stopped taking the bodies down. Just another job that got lost in the growing panic. By the time evacuation orders came, we were down to 100 people. I estimate that around 400 ended themselves in that tunnel. I've only visited him once since the project shut down. Only had the guts to go look once. Barely made it out alive. I felt compelled to try and face up to him, acknowledge the role I played. Only that meant actually getting to the door at the end of the tunnel, which was, by this point, pitch black except for my torch, and blocked almost entirely with hanging bodies. So many, pressed together so close that I had no hope of making my way through without bumping into one. Reminded me of the jungle, funnily enough, of a thick, claustrophobic forest made of dried skin and brittle ligaments, different colors and shapes, and of course, different levels of decomp. Some had lost their noses, lips and eyes. Others were a little bloated, but still recognizable. Not friends, really. I don't think I actually made one solitary friend on that project, but colleagues, people who were under my charge. They looked sad. All of them looked sad. They should have been buried at home with their families, but instead, they were locked all the way in the ass end of nowhere. Of course, you can bet your ass the agency will make sure no one ever knows the truth. You know, I still have contact with them. Anything I post gets screened. Arrogant assholes know that no one's gonna take me seriously. No record of this project anywhere. All those people, just ghosts in a system too big for any one person to keep track of it all. You know how many people go missing in the United States in a year? What about Europe? Or the whole damn world? God, this project was just a drop in the ocean. I wanted to put it to bed, to see if I could get some kind of answer from him. It was that idea, trying to get some resolution to this nightmare, that gave me the strength to push past the first dead body and go deeper into that tunnel. It reminded me of trying to make your way to the front of a gig, only deathly silent, and the people you barged past swung gently back and forth. The sound of makeshift nooses tightening in the dark. I think the worst part was the limited vision. My light was just a lone disc, and God, it was pitch black in that place, like caving, only the floor is slick, and you don't have to worry about a ravine. Made me think about being in the bottom of the ocean, With all the corpses, visibility was never more than a few foot ahead. I remember panicking at the realization I could easily get turned around and, well, if all those lost souls didn't let me go? What if I wound up going in circles for hours, days even, on end? Just round and round. The nearest wall could be right there, and I wouldn't know it. Just bones and teeth and ribs and hanging entrails. All of them cold to the touch, freezing. Obviously, that's why we'd put him down there. The place was cold, my own breath visible in the air. But the bodies were like the meat you grab out of the fridge in a supermarket. It was just awful. I found the fresh ones the hardest to stomach. A really rotten body looks almost like a prop. It isn't, don't get me wrong. You look at it and your brain tells you damn well it ain't a prop. But it's a hell of a lot easier to convince yourself it's just a thing when it hasn't got eyes or skin. But the fresh ones, sometimes they still had expressions like anger or sadness on their faces. They made me feel watched, and the fact they were cold and slick with condensation. Every time I bumped into one, it took everything I had not to let out a whimper. And they moved. They didn't move, not like that. But there were no drafts down there. It was perfectly still. They'd been perfectly still for months after the project shut down. And then I came along and disturbed them, and it was like a giant Newton's cradle, a static system that I put energy into. It began to sway and twist and bump. I'd knock one, and a fraction of a second later it would knock me back, jostling against my cheek or my arm as inertia rocked it back and forth. 10 minutes in, too far to turn back. That was when the nightmare began. Started small. I lost my ability to track what body was where and which ones were sent swinging by my own clumsy movements. And then fingers combed my hair. I cried out. Another set touched my beard, my face. I forced myself onwards and started making eye contact with one too many dead men for it to simply be an accident. Their expressions changed from sullen and listless to angry and cruel, leering smiles and curled lips. Then came the unmistakable sensation of someone deliberately grabbing for my arm. I had to shake it loose, too afraid to look back and face the possibility that I'd see one of them moving and scowling. I pushed on, constantly having to shake cold fingers off my elbow or my collar. They groped incessantly, looking for anything to hold on to. Firm grips pinched my belly fat, my shoulders, my chest, and then they started reaching for my eyes. At one point, I made the mistake of crying out, and a freezing cold finger with a slightly furry texture slid into my mouth. The only relief came when I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled. The entire time, my mind raced with a terrible possibility that I really was just being sent in circles, over and over and over. And they were never going to let me leave. I would die down there, in the dark, smothered by their rotting hands. Goddamn, I came close to giving up. When my torch finally alighted upon an open space, I cried out, a heaving wet sob made of relief and joy, and my muscles, given new life, worked overtime to get me out of that horrible nightmare and into freedom. I didn't stop until I bumped my head against the steel wall with a dull clang and looked up to see the vault's door. At last, the place we'd frozen him. I got up with what little dignity I had left, brushed down my clothes, and risked only the briefest of glances back. The bodies looked inert now, just like they had before I entered. I could have tricked myself into thinking it was my imagination, only half my shirt was now in tatters on the floor, and I could still see strips of it still clenched in a few of their hands. I did my best to compose myself, and I entered the vault. We hadn't left him in a very nice state. The plan was to catalogue everything. Yeah, we excised the most striking biological anomalies, but the remaining flesh? We wanted to know everything. Every last capillary, every last cell. We wanted it recorded. So we had this special machine flown in. It works by taking a piece of flesh and slicing into a layer that's barely a micrometer thick and depositing it into a slide. That slide is digested and then stored in specialized cold refrigeration units. It's usually used on a sample not much bigger than a potato. But for him, we had something specially made. Frozen, stood vertical, we put him on the machine where it worked, creating about one slice every 3 hours. Only at the end, well, first, no one came to take the slides away, so they had gathered on the floor below in a terrible mess. And second, no one had bothered to check if he was still dead. Stupid of us, really. Of course he came back to life, only this time, he didn't get to leave the cave. I often wonder if he had anything left to say, but by then, the machine had reached his nose. Just his eyes at the top of his head looking right at me, following me. God, we made a mess of things, didn't we? Made the Romans look gentle in comparison. I fell to my knees and begged for forgiveness. And the worst part? He gave it. Obviously not verbally, but it shouldn't surprise you to know he had other ways of putting thoughts in my head. I was so angry at myself. I was positive I'd find some kind of punishment waiting for me. But I didn't. He forgave me, told me I was loved. After everything I'd done, God, that hurt the most. I didn't deserve it. Still don't. And then he gave me the Third Testament, or rather, the Cliff Notes. Not enough to drive me nuts, but the gist of it, so to speak, did a number on me anyway. By the time I was done sobbing on the floor, I looked up, and he was gone. Nothing remained, just broken glass and a machine cutting empty air. Going back through the tunnel was no easier than going in, but I hardly remember it. I lost a couple of weeks after that little trip down below, but eventually I came to in my office. Now I stay above ground. I've asked for rescue, but the agency feels I best serve my country by staying where I am, making sure nothing else leaks out. It's messed up, but I think for once, they might be right. I've considered sharing what he gave me, considered even putting it in bits of writing here. Might even go get the full testament and upload it. But that would involve reading it. And like I said, I'm a coward, and I don't want to die. Everyone who reads it dies by their own hand. I guess all I can say is, the Third Testament, it's something of a warning, an outline of what's coming our way. So bad that he came just to offer us a way out, a promise that there's somewhere else, and an acknowledgement that we're going to need it. makes me think of Coates, smartest man I ever met, whose first reaction to knowing what was on the way was to try and engineer something to wipe humanity all out. Given to what we did to him, I wonder if we don't deserve it.